She was found in the summer of 1973 in a small hospital in Burlington, Vermont. Her body was frail, her liver ruined by years of devotion to the bottle, her name scarcely whispered in the streets where once it had been shouted across continents. Few knew she was there. Fewer still visited her bedside. Veronica Lake, the woman who had once enchanted a nation with a single falling lock of hair, breathed her last in obscurity, and Hollywood scarcely paused to notice. Her death, quiet and almost secret, seemed like the closing of a book no one had thought to finish reading. Before we drift into her tale, I welcome you, wherever you are listening from tonight. Perhaps you are in a quiet room, or in a distant city, or lying awake in the hours before dawn. Tell me in the comments where you listen so that your memory will join others across the world, a small network of shared time. And if you wish, press the subscribe button so this voice may return to you again when another night asks for remembrance. Now let us begin. There she lay, in the final days of her life, her eyes closed against the harsh hospital light. The nurses knew her only as a woman in her 50s, small and troubled, her frame thin as though already halfway gone to another world. Yet there was a time when those very eyes had stared out from the silver screen, luminous and unforgettable, shaping the dreams of millions. Once, in the early 40s, she had been Hollywood's brightest comet, not merely a star among others, but a figure whose image alone could command the gaze of nations at war. How strange, then, to imagine her ending not with flashbulbs, but with silence. It is this silence, this distance between the brilliance of her rise and the dimness of her fall, that compels us to travel backward through the corridors of her life. For it is not enough to recall the films, nor to praise the beauty immortalized in celluloid. What lingers is the question: how could someone so adored, so seemingly untouchable, unravel into loneliness and poverty? Was it fate or her own hand? Was she destroyed by Hollywood or by obsessions of her own making? These questions, like the smoke curling in an old theater, refuse to settle. The story begins not in Hollywood, but in the quiet past of a child named Constance Frances Marie Ockelman. Born in Brooklyn in November of 1922. She would not become Veronica Lake until years later, but even as a child there were hints of restlessness in her. Her father, a ship worker, died in an accident when she was still young, and the house grew cold with absence. Her mother remarried, bringing another man into their lives, but the wound of that early loss marked her spirit. In such childhood shadows, identity is often shaped. Half longings, half defenses, the girl staring into mirrors, uncertain whether she was ordinary or destined for some greater illusion. And yet, for now, let us hold the image of her final days. The woman lying in the hospital bed, remembered by only a handful, still carried in her body the memory of triumph and ruin. One cannot separate them, for they are woven together like threads in a tapestry, too intricate to untangle. She was allure and danger, discipline and rebellion, adoration and disdain. To those who loved her films, she was the dream behind the screen. To those who worked beside her, she was often a storm, unpredictable, sharp-tongued, impossible to manage. Between these truths lay the deeper mystery of her soul. Perhaps this is why her story haunts us still. She was not simply the product of an industry that devours and discards, nor simply the victim of her own choices. She was both and more, a reminder of how fragile the line is between glory and exile, between obsession and oblivion. As you listen, I invite you not to seek judgment, but to wander slowly through the fragments of her life, as though through the rooms of an abandoned house where dust floats in beams of light and the echo of former laughter clings to the walls. In the quiet of Vermont, the world went on without her. New stars had risen, the cinema itself was changing, and her name slipped from the lips of critics and fans alike. Yet when the reels of This Gun for Hire or The Glass Key flicker to life, there she is still, eternal in her youth, her hair falling over one eye, her voice edged with cool indifference. The camera does not record the poverty, the illnesses, the broken marriages. It records only the illusion, and it is the illusion that keeps her alive. But how did the illusion begin? Let us travel back now, not to the lonely bed in Vermont, but to the noisy streets of Brooklyn, where a small girl looked out of a window and wondered what it meant to belong to this world. The girl who would one day be Veronica Lake was restless, curious, and mischievous. Teachers remembered her as bright but unruly, her mind wandering during lessons, her imagination too large for the classroom walls. Her mother, Constance Sr., held ambitions for her, though not yet of Hollywood. She sought to place her daughter in schools where discipline might temper her wildness. But as so often in such tales, the attempts to bind her spirit only sharpened its hunger for escape. Her father's death when she was just 10 years old was a wound that never quite healed. Harry Eugene Ockelman had worked as a ship's fireman, and one day an accident took him from the family without warning. To a child, such loss is not simply absence, but a fracture in the very order of life. Constance grew quieter, sometimes defiant, and in later years she would speak little of him. It is tempting to imagine that this early tragedy shaped the edges of her cold allure, the hardness beneath the beauty. The remarriage of her mother brought both stability and dissonance. A new household formed, yet Constance remained somewhat apart within it, unsure of her place. By adolescence, her beauty was drawing notice. Sharp cheekbones, pale eyes, and a gaze that seemed to know more than her years. This gaze, so alluring on screen, was already being rehearsed before mirrors in the quiet hours of girlhood. And then came the decision that would alter the course of her life. The family moved to Florida, and from there she was eventually sent to schools that promised refinement, including the Bliss Hayden School of Acting in Los Angeles. She was still only a teenager, her name not yet changed, her destiny still unformed, but she had already begun to imagine the stage and the screen as places where she might not only belong, but reign. Here, in these formative years, lies the seed of obsession. For what is obsession but the refusal to accept limits, the relentless hunger for transformation? Constance, soon to be Veronica, carried within her the ache of her father's absence, the sense of being out of place, and the shimmering hope that performance could rewrite all of it. She did not yet know the cost, nor the shadows waiting within the dream. She knew only that the dream was brighter than the life she was leaving behind, and so the story carries us forward. From the stillness of Vermont deathbeds, to the restless child in Brooklyn, to the teenage girl stepping onto the threshold of Hollywood. Ahead lay the dazzling ascent, the years when the world adored her, and the years when the world abandoned her. The journey will not be rushed, for it is not a tale of speed, but of shadows, of gradual revelation. Her eyes, closed in that final room, had once opened wide upon the lights of studios, the glow of cameras, the applause of strangers. Shall we see them again? Let us follow the light for now as it falls across the stage of her beginnings. The light that fell across the stage of her beginnings was dim and uncertain, as though the world itself hesitated to reveal its path. The girl still known as Constance carried with her the memories of Brooklyn's noise, the grief of her father's sudden departure, and the uneasy balance of a household that never seemed entirely whole. In the quiet hours, she would sit before a mirror and practice her expressions, tilting her head to catch the light, experimenting with the tilt of an eyebrow or the shadow cast by her cheekbones. There was no audience yet, only the imagination of a child rehearsing for a life that had not arrived. From the window of her home, she would sometimes hear the sound of trains moving beyond the distance, iron beasts dragging themselves toward other cities, other fates. Perhaps she thought of her father, who had once labored with ships that too carried lives away. Perhaps she thought only of escape, though she could not have known where such thoughts might lead. In the memory of that sound, one can sense the beginning of her journey toward the stage and the screen. For it is often so. Before a life of renown, there is the echo of a departure, the sound of wheels on tracks, a door opening into the unknown. Her mother, determined that her daughter not remain idle, sought refinement and structure. It was said that Constance's unruly imagination required discipline, that her sharpness of tongue and restless energy might otherwise consume her. Schools were chosen, including those far from Brooklyn, where the hope was that elegance and ambition might be sculpted from wild beginnings. But such molding often awakens rather than quiets desire. Each class, each exercise in speech or posture revealed to Constance that she could inhabit roles beyond herself. She began to understand performance not as mere play, but as a craft that could shape her very destiny. In these years, the girl's beauty became unmistakable. The pale clarity of her eyes, the sharp cut of her cheekbones, the way her hair fell in natural waves. It was not beauty in the soft, conventional sense, but a beauty tinged with mystery, a face that concealed as much as it revealed. Teachers and acquaintances remarked upon it, some with admiration, others with unease. It was as if she carried within her something slightly removed from the ordinary world, an aura that drew attention while keeping intimacy at a distance. This distance, both alluring and isolating, would follow her always. The move to Florida and then to Los Angeles for further schooling placed her closer to the very heart of an industry that would soon claim her. At the Bliss Hayden School of Acting, she encountered the first structured attempt to channel her gifts. There, amid the rehearsals and recitations, the girl began to imagine herself not merely as a student, but as an actress in waiting. She was still Constance Ockelman in name, but in spirit something new was forming, a persona that would soon eclipse the girl who bore it. It is curious to reflect upon the invention of names. To call someone by a different name is not only to rename them, but to summon an entirely new identity. When Constance became Veronica Lake, she was not merely adjusting a label. She was crossing a threshold, shedding the ordinary syllables of her birth for the flowing, mysterious cadence of a title that sounded both cool and unreachable. The choice of Veronica has been attributed to advisors, to circumstance, to the marketing machinery of Hollywood. Yet one wonders if deep within, the girl herself had always longed for such transformation. After all, what is a name but a mask, a chosen illusion to hold before the world? New York was her first true stage of transformation. The city, restless and alive with ambition, offered her the energy she had long sought. She found herself among aspiring performers, each chasing the elusive light of recognition. The theaters, the studios, the classes, all of it shimmered before her like the promise of a world in which she might finally matter, in which her restless imagination might become her livelihood. She walked the streets with the poise of one rehearsing for an unseen audience. The buildings rose around her like vast backdrops, the sounds of traffic and voices like the score to her personal performance. Though she had not yet secured fame, she carried herself as if already marked by destiny. It is said that those who succeed in performance often live as though watched, even in solitude. For Veronica, though the name was still only beginning to adhere, life itself was already a stage. It was during these early years that she began to secure minor work, glimpses of opportunity that hinted at what lay ahead. Each role, though small, affirmed her presence, and each rejection fueled her resolve. She studied faces in magazines, learned the gestures of actresses who had ascended before her, and imagined her own reflection in their place. Yet even as she absorbed these lessons, she was not content to imitate. Her coolness, her slight detachment was uniquely her own. Where others smiled brightly to please, she often withheld expression, creating a tension that drew the eye more powerfully than charm ever could. What did she feel in these moments as her name began to spread among agents and directors? Pride, perhaps, but also unease. To be seen is to be both exalted and vulnerable. The girl who had once been a restless child now found herself shaped by expectations she did not fully control. To others, she was a face, a body, a presence to be molded into roles. To herself, she was still uncertain, carrying within her the ghosts of her father's absence, the complicated ties of family, the longing to escape the ordinary. And so the city became her crucible, the place where she shed Constance and emerged as Veronica. The metamorphosis was not sudden, but gradual, like a shadow lengthening across a wall as the sun moved slowly downward. Each step she took, each role she auditioned for, each person who remarked upon her beauty, drew her deeper into the current of inevitability. By the time Hollywood itself came calling, she was no longer simply a girl with ambitions. She was Veronica Lake, already cloaked in the aura of mystery that would soon define her. Yet even in these beginnings, one can sense the quiet seeds of obsession. To chase a dream is one thing, to allow it to consume all else is another. Veronica, though she could not yet know it, was already bound to a path that would demand sacrifice, a path that would one day leave her broken upon the rocks of fame's indifference. For now, though, the dream was ascendant, the city alive with promise, the mirrors reflecting a face the world was preparing to embrace. In the stillness of evening, as she returned from classes or small performances, perhaps she paused once more at her mirror, letting her hair fall across one eye, testing the effect without fully realizing its power. The gesture would soon become iconic, copied by millions, condemned by wartime authorities, celebrated by soldiers abroad. But at this moment, it was only a young woman experimenting with her reflection, unaware that this simple fall of hair would one day define her image forever. Outside, the train still roared, carrying lives across states and cities, their sound both a reminder of the past and a summons to the future. For Constance, now Veronica, those trains no longer symbolized escape. They symbolized arrival. The journey had begun, and Hollywood awaited. Her reflection in the mirror lingered like a ghostly companion, hair falling slightly across one eye, lips parted as though preparing for a line that no one had yet written. It was here, in such quiet rehearsals, that the persona of Veronica Lake first revealed itself, though she did not yet understand its full power. The mirror offered both comfort and prophecy, a reminder that within the pale frame of Constance Ockelman lay a woman whom the world would come to know by another name. Each gesture she practiced was both play and destiny, as though her image were calling itself into existence before the camera had even turned toward her. Hollywood was not far from those mirrors, for the industry already stretched its arms across the schools, theaters, and agencies where she studied. A young actress could not walk a block without sensing the presence of its influence. Casting calls pinned to walls, rumors of directors searching for new faces, whispers of contracts waiting to be signed. For Veronica, still balancing between girlhood and adulthood, these whispers were like the hum of fate itself. She would walk with her books, her hair pinned in modest fashion, and yet there was already in her step the rhythm of one preparing to ascend a stage larger than any classroom could provide. Her earliest roles were small, almost invisible, yet they placed her before cameras, and that was enough. An extra in one picture, a fleeting presence in another, her figure blended into the backdrop of scenes designed for others. But even in the background, she was noticed. Cinematographers remarked on the way her features held the light, how her eyes carried a strange mixture of cool detachment and hidden vulnerability. It was not warmth that drew the gaze, but mystery, And mystery was the rarest currency of all in an industry flooded with eager smiles. The industry's alchemy soon went to work upon her. Hair was styled, voice trained, posture corrected. The raw material of Constance was refined into Veronica, though the name itself was bestowed later, after agents and publicists concluded that something more ethereal was needed than the solid earthly syllables of Ockelman. A lake, calm on the surface, depth concealed beneath. Such was the imagery they imagined, and Veronica, a name both exotic and classic, seemed to complete the illusion. Thus, through the machinery of invention, Veronica Lake was born. Yet one cannot help but wonder if the machinery merely gave form to something she had already been shaping for herself all along. Her breakthrough came not with grand fanfare, but with the slow accumulation of presence. In 1941, when she appeared in I Wanted Wings, audiences were struck by her hairstyle, a long, flowing cascade that tumbled over one eye in a manner at once alluring and defiant. This peekaboo look was, according to accounts, accidental, the result of a moment when her hair fell forward during a screen test. Yet accidents, in the language of cinema, often become fate. The hairstyle captured imaginations instantly, imitated by women across the nation, criticized by authorities who worried it interfered with wartime factory work, and immortalized in photographs sent to soldiers abroad. From an accident, an icon was born. But before this accident became legend, Veronica lived through the careful, sometimes painful process of transformation demanded by the studios. Her voice was adjusted to carry an edge of languor, her wardrobe refined to emphasize not girlhood, but enigmatic womanhood. The persona required consistency, for Hollywood did not reward contradictions. She must always appear aloof, always mysterious, always coolly radiant. The young woman who had once been unruly in classrooms, quick-tongued and restless, now had to contain herself within the silhouette of a femme fatale. It is a paradox many actors face. To achieve freedom through performance, they must surrender to an image not entirely their own. Yet, as she stepped into this new identity, there was exhilaration too. Imagine the thrill of standing upon a soundstage, lights trained upon her, camera lenses capturing her every movement, crew members whispering behind the equipment that she had it, that ineffable quality that separates stars from hopefuls. Imagine her hearing her name, her new name, spoken aloud in contracts, in articles, in conversations where she was no longer just another aspiring actress, but a figure of intrigue. For a girl who had once felt out of place in classrooms, who had lived through loss and dislocation, such recognition must have seemed intoxicating. Still, behind the lights, there was unease. To maintain mystery is to risk isolation, for the mask cannot easily be removed when the performance ends. Veronica was expected to be Veronica not only on the screen, but in interviews, in photographs, in every public gesture. The studio system, powerful and unyielding, enforced these roles with contracts and reputations. To defy them was to risk obscurity. And so, she became what they asked of her, even as the fragments of her true self, Constance, the girl who had lost a father, the restless child, the mischievous student, were buried beneath layers of illusion. Her early films revealed the tension between artifice and authenticity. In Sullivan's Travels, 1941, directed by Preston Sturges, she played opposite Joel McCrea, offering not only beauty but wit, a glimpse of her sharpness that was often hidden by the roles designed for allure. Audiences loved her, critics praised her, and suddenly she was not merely a promising newcomer, but a star in the making. Her pairing with Alan Ladd in This Gun for Hire would soon cement her reputation, but even before that moment, there was already a sense that she belonged not to herself, but to the world of cinema. How does it feel, one wonders, to To see your image on posters across cities, your name spoken by strangers, your face sent overseas to men fighting wars? Does it feel like triumph, or does it feel like being consumed? Veronica, in these early years, seemed to accept the attention with poise, yet those who knew her privately spoke of her sharp humor, her impatience with fools, her tendency to rebel against instructions. Beneath the lake's calm surface, currents were stirring. The peekaboo hairstyle born of accident became both blessing and curse. It distinguished her from all others, creating an instantly recognizable silhouette. Women rushed to imitate it, hairdressers struggled to replicate its fall, magazines praised its allure. But with imitation came criticism, for factory work during the war years made such hairstyles dangerous. Government campaigns urged women to adopt safer looks, and Veronica herself appeared in demonstrations, her hair tied back, urging responsibility. Yet even this controversy only deepened the legend. A hairstyle had become a cultural symbol, inseparable from the actress who wore it. In the evenings, when the cameras were turned off and the studio lots emptied, Veronica would retreat into quieter spaces. There, perhaps before another mirror, she might let the hair fall differently, no longer a weapon of allure, but simply her own. Did she ever look into that reflection and long for the ordinary girl she had once been? Or had the mask already grown too close to the skin to be removed? These are questions we cannot answer, but we may feel them lingering, like shadows at the edge of light. The girl who had once rehearsed in solitude now found herself the subject of a nation's fascination. The transition from obscurity to stardom had been swift, perhaps too swift, leaving little time to reconcile the two identities within her. Hollywood had claimed her, and though she walked its corridors with elegance, something in her remained unsettled, as if aware that what rises quickly may also fall. And so the reflection in the mirror changed. No longer a rehearsal, it was now the image of Veronica Lake, star of Paramount Pictures, bearer of the peekaboo legend, embodiment of mystery. The mirror no longer showed Constance Ockelman, and perhaps she herself no longer remembered clearly the girl who had once gazed from it. The stage was set, the persona complete, and the films awaited. The quiet child of Brooklyn, the restless student, the aspiring actress of New York, had become the screen siren of Hollywood's golden age. The world would soon fall under her spell, and she, in turn, would fall under the weight of its demands. The mirror, silent witness to her transformation, still reflected her face. But what face was it truly? The question remained unanswered, even as the cameras called her to step once more into the light. The mirror, still and unchanging, had no answer to give. It reflected only the surface, the veil of beauty arranged for the world to see. Yet beyond the glass, beyond the lights and cameras, a story was unfolding that would bind her forever to the image she had crafted, or perhaps the image that had been thrust upon her. It began quietly, as so many legends do, with a small role that flickered briefly and then faded, and yet from that flicker came the spark that would ignite her legend. Her presence in I Wanted Wings in 1941 was brief, but it was enough. The role itself was not central, yet her appearance held the strange magnetism that the camera could not deny. Audiences who watched were not yet sure who she was, but they remembered her nonetheless. And it was during this moment that the accident occurred. Her hair, loose and unrestrained, fell across her right eye as she turned, creating an effect that seemed unplanned yet perfectly deliberate. The peekaboo look was born not from design but from chance, and yet chance, once caught by the camera, becomes history. The hairstyle captured the imagination almost instantly. It was mysterious, sensuous, and unlike anything audiences had seen before. Where most actresses of the era kept their hair carefully styled to reveal their faces fully, Veronica's partial concealment suggested something withheld, something hidden behind the curtain of golden waves. To see only half her gaze was to feel the intensity of what remained unseen. Women rushed to imitate it, though few could achieve the same effect, for the allure was not merely in the hair, but in the way Veronica carried it, an extension of her cool detachment, her aura of mystery. In those early years at Paramount, the studio recognized what they had stumbled upon. A new type of star could be fashioned here, one who did not sparkle with overt charm, but who smoldered with enigma. They began to craft roles that would frame her allure, pairing her with Alan Ladd, a man of small stature whose quiet intensity matched her own. Together, they created a chemistry that electrified screens without ever needing grand displays of passion. In their silences, in their glances, audiences felt more than dialogue could ever convey. But before the great pairings and the celebrated noirs, Veronica was still learning the mechanics of the industry. The sound stages were vast, the hours long, the demands unrelenting. Directors instructed her to stand just so, to tilt her chin at a precise angle, to allow the light to carve her cheekbones into something sculptural. She obeyed when she had to, rebelled when she could, and often earned the reputation of being difficult, though perhaps it was less difficulty than an unwillingness to let herself be reduced to machinery. For Veronica, the illusion of control was fragile. To be treated as an object, even while celebrated, was a wound she could not easily conceal. Yet the world outside did not see the struggle. It saw only the image, the shimmering blonde with the enigmatic glance, the woman whose hairstyle had launched 1,000 imitations. The war years heightened her allure, for soldiers carried her image in photographs, painted her likeness on aircraft, and spoke her name in barracks. She became not simply an actress, but a symbol, a reminder of home, of beauty preserved amid destruction. To men fighting overseas, Veronica Lake was more than a star. She was an embodiment of the dream that life might still contain mystery, allure, and tenderness. How strange, then, that such a symbol could emerge from an accident. One wonders what Veronica thought in those early days, when stylists tried to perfect the peekaboo effect, when journalists praised it, when letters arrived from admirers entranced by the look. Did she smile at the absurdity of it? Did she feel pride, or did she feel the quiet weight of being defined by something so trivial? Perhaps it was all of these at once, for stardom often binds the grand to the accidental, the profound to the superficial. Her own feelings toward the hairstyle were complicated. While it distinguished her, it also confined her. Directors fretted about how to light her face without obscuring too much, and later, as factories filled with women during the war, authorities declared the style unsafe, fearing that loose strands could be caught in machinery. Veronica herself was urged to demonstrate safer alternatives, appearing in newsreels with her hair tied back, advising women to avoid the glamorous style in favor of practicality. Yet such campaigns only deepened her myth, for the forbidden often shines brighter in memory than the permitted. The persona of Veronica Lake, femme fatale and goddess of mystery, was taking shape with every film she touched. Audiences saw her on the screen and believed in the illusion. But behind the illusion, the young woman who had once been Constance was already beginning to strain against the weight of it. Fame, when sudden, can overwhelm as much as it elevates. It demands constancy, even when the human soul longs for change. To remain Veronica Lake was to silence parts of herself that did not fit the role. And yet there must have been moments of exhilaration. To stand before a camera and know that one's image would be projected across the world, to hear the applause of strangers, to read one's name in reviews. Such moments cannot be dismissed. They offered her validation, a proof that the restless girl from Brooklyn had not been forgotten by fate. The dream she had rehearsed before mirrors had come true, though it carried with it the shadows of its own undoing. Paramount saw her as an asset, a marketable star whose allure could carry films to box office success. Contracts were drawn, roles assigned, publicity campaigns devised. Veronica's image appeared not only in theaters, but in magazines, on posters, in the imagination of a nation. And while the machinery of Hollywood turned, the young woman at its center found herself both exalted and imprisoned. For what happens when a persona becomes more real to the world than the person who wears it? The peekaboo hairstyle, that accidental creation, had become the symbol of Veronica Lake herself. She could not escape it, even if she wished. Wherever she went, it was remarked upon, requested, imitated. It was not merely a fashion, it was her identity. The mirror reflected it back at her, reminding her that she was no longer Constance, no longer simply herself, but Veronica Lake, the woman with the hidden eye, the enigma behind the veil of hair. And so her life moved forward, bound to this image. The doors of Hollywood had opened, the world had taken notice, and the legend was underway. Yet already, beneath the surface, there was a sense of fragility, as though the very hairstyle that defined her also foreshadowed the shadows to come. For what is concealed often hides more than beauty. Sometimes it hides sorrow, rebellion, or the restless stirring of a spirit not easily contained. The strand of hair that fell across her face on that first screen test remained there, in memory, a veil between her and the world. And as the cameras rolled, as the applause grew louder, the veil thickened, hiding not only one eye but perhaps her truer self. The strand of hair that fell across her eye became not only her own veil, but the veil through which the world came to dream. In barracks across distant continents, where the nights were filled with the scent of oil and gunmetal, and the air shivered with the uncertainty of dawn, posters of Veronica Lake hung on walls made of wood and canvas. Soldiers far from home pinned her likeness above their bunks, her cool gaze and half-hidden smile promising something both unattainable and strangely comforting. The rustling of those posters in the drafts of army huts became a lullaby of sorts, a whisper of glamour in places stripped bare of it. Veronica Lake, who had once been only Constance Ockelman rehearsing before mirrors, had now become a symbol of American morale. Her image, multiplied in countless photographs and pin-ups, was carried in pockets, folded into letters, taped to helmets. To those men, she was more than a star. She was the embodiment of mystery and longing, a fragment of beauty preserved in a world devoured by violence. It is strange to think of how a hairstyle born of accident could travel so far, crossing oceans and deserts, finding its way into the hearts of men who would never hear her voice except in films screened on makeshift projectors under starlit skies. The studios, eager to nourish this fascination, placed her in roles that deepened the allure. This gun for hire in 1942 paired her with Alan Ladd for the first time, and the effect was electric. Ladd, diminutive in stature but intense in presence, stood beside Veronica as though fate had designed their pairing. Their chemistry was quiet yet undeniable, a tension that needed no excess of words. Where other screen couples relied on overt passion, Veronica and Ladd drew audiences in with silence, with glances weighted with unspoken desire and suspicion. Together, they embodied the shadows of film noir, where danger and allure walk hand in hand. Her roles in The Glass Key and The Blue Dahlia further solidified this identity. Always she appeared as the mysterious woman, the one who could not be easily read, the one whose beauty carried the edge of danger. Audiences thrilled at her performances. Critics wrote of her as the quintessential femme fatale, and the studio rejoiced at box office receipts. Veronica Lake was no longer an aspiring actress. She was an icon of Hollywood's golden age, a figure whose image had slipped beyond the screen into the collective imagination of a nation at war. But for Veronica herself, the experience was more complex. Fame brought adoration, yet it also brought confinement. The studio demanded repetition, casting her in variations of the same role, encouraging the same hairstyle, the same cool detachment, the same aura of mystery. To them, she was a formula that worked, a face that guaranteed success. To her, perhaps, it felt like being reduced to a single note in a symphony she longed to explore more fully. The same accident that had made her famous now held her captive. And yet, there must have been moments when she allowed herself to feel the magnitude of her influence. To walk down a street and see women imitating her hairstyle, to open a magazine and find her face gazing back from glossy pages, to hear her name spoken, not with hesitation, but with reverence. These were affirmations of power. For a woman who had grown up uncertain, restless, shaped by loss, this recognition may have felt intoxicating, even as it left her uneasy. The paradox of fame is that it nourishes the hunger for validation, while also deepening the void it cannot fill. The war years magnified this paradox. On the one hand, Veronica was celebrated as a national treasure, her image used to boost morale, her presence invoked as a symbol of resilience. On the other, she began to feel the strain of expectations that no one person could bear. She was asked to be not simply an actress, but an ideal, an emblem of beauty, mystery, and comfort for millions she would never meet. In such circumstances, where does the self reside? Was Constance still present within Veronica, or had she been consumed entirely by the illusion? Her personal life during these years was marked by turbulence. Married to art director John Detley, she struggled to balance the demands of home with the demands of stardom. The war pulled families apart, and Hollywood, with its endless hours and insistent schedules, offered little sanctuary. Though she bore a child, the marriage was strained, and divorce soon followed. The glamorous woman on the screen, adored by millions, was in private a young mother, uncertain and often alone, her marriage unraveling as swiftly as her career soared. And still, the posters rustled in distant barracks, the soldiers dreaming of her as though she belonged to them, never knowing the reality of her solitude. The divide between image and truth grew larger with each passing year, a chasm into which Veronica herself sometimes stumbled. She was adored but not understood, celebrated but not comforted. The world knew Veronica Lake, but who remained to know Constance? It is worth pausing here to reflect on the strange nature of obsession. For the soldiers, Veronica represented an obsession born of longing, a focus for their dreams amid the chaos of war. For the studios, she was an obsession of profit, an image to be reproduced endlessly, a formula not to be questioned. And for Veronica herself, fame became an obsession too, both desired and resented, both clung to and resisted. Obsession, in its many forms, became the current beneath her life, pulling her in directions she could neither fully control nor entirely escape. The war would end, but the image of Veronica Lake as a wartime icon would linger. Even as her career began to falter in later years, veterans would remember her with a peculiar intensity, recalling not her performances in detail, but the feeling of her presence in posters and photographs. She had been a companion in their loneliness, a symbol of hope in their fear. Such memories outlive the films themselves, carved into the hearts of those who once needed them most. Yet, as the soldiers returned home and the nation shifted from war to peace, tastes began to change. The femme fatale of the early 40s gave way to new styles, new stars, new obsessions. Veronica, still luminous, found herself caught in the cruel tide of Hollywood's perpetual hunger for novelty. What had once made her unique now threatened to make her outdated. The hairstyle, the mystery, the cool detachment, were these still desirable, or had they already begun to fade? The rustling of posters in wartime huts grew silent as they were taken down, folded, forgotten. And with their silence came the first hints of decline, though the world did not yet see it. For now the image remained, powerful and alluring, but beneath it the first cracks were forming. Veronica Lake had reached the height of her stardom, yet within the height lay the seed of the fall to come. The soldiers, asleep beneath her gaze, dreamed of a world they might return to, a world where beauty like hers was possible. But what dreams awaited Veronica herself when the lights of the studio dimmed and the applause subsided into echoes? Did she dream of freedom or of escape? Or did she dream only of silence, the kind that never answers? The echo of wartime gunfire lingered in the ears of audiences long after the theaters had emptied, a sound that blurred with the shadows cast upon the screen. It was within these shadows that Veronica Lake took her place, not merely as an actress, but as a presence that defined the very shape of desire and danger in cinema. The femme fatale, a figure older than Hollywood itself, found in her a new expression, icy, restrained, and yet burning with a quiet intensity that seemed to withhold more than it revealed. If the soldiers had dreamed of her as a comforting vision pinned to their walls, audiences now encountered her as something far more ambiguous. The woman who might offer salvation or betrayal, love or ruin, all within the same glance. This gun for hire, her first pairing with Alan Ladd, exemplified this transformation. In that film, she was not merely the love interest, nor a supporting figure, but an enigma, woven into the heart of the narrative. Ladd's assassin, cold and efficient, found in her a mirror of his own solitude. Together they created a chemistry that was not fiery but smoldering, not loud but resonant. Their scenes together carried the weight of silences, of eyes meeting and parting, of gestures that suggested entire worlds of emotion without ever naming them. This was the language of Noir, and Veronica spoke it with a fluency that seemed instinctive. Her allure was not the sweetness of a starlet, nor the warmth of the girl next door. It was the allure of distance, of danger, of a beauty that might consume as easily as it might console. The peekaboo hair only deepened the mystery, a veil that suggested hidden truths, concealed motives, and secrets best left unspoken. Audiences were fascinated not only by what she revealed, but by what she withheld. In her silences, they imagined the possibility of betrayal, and in her glances, they imagined the promise of forbidden intimacy. The glass key followed, again pairing her with Alan Ladd, again reinforcing their strange and magnetic chemistry. By now, critics and audiences alike saw them as a natural pair, as though destiny had fused their screen lives together. He with his small stature and restrained intensity, and she with her cool reserve and veiled allure, created a balance that transcended the script itself. They seemed to exist not merely within the films, but within the archetype of noir itself. Their images projected like shadows across the collective imagination. It is curious to reflect on how much of this was artifice and how much was Veronica herself. For though the roles were written for mystery, she carried into them a real detachment, a coolness that was not entirely performance. Directors often struggled with her indifference, her lack of eagerness to please, her tendency to deliver lines in a voice that seemed almost flat. And yet, what frustrated directors entranced audiences. The flatness became calm, the calm became mystery, and the mystery became power. By refusing to offer warmth, she compelled the world to lean toward her, to imagine depths in her silences, to construct meaning from what she withheld. In this way, Veronica Lake did not merely play the femme fatale, she embodied its evolution. Earlier incarnations of the archetype had often been overtly seductive, dramatic, flamboyant in their danger. Veronica's version was subtler, cooler, less obvious. Her femme fatale was not the woman who loudly announced her threat, but the woman whose threat was implied, who seemed almost unaware of the devastation she could cause. This quietness, this restraint, made her all the more compelling. And yet, even as she ascended into legend, there was a fragility beneath it all. For to embody such roles is to risk being consumed by them, to find one's identity blurred with archetypes not easily shed. Veronica was not only playing enigmatic women, she was becoming one in the public imagination, her personal life subsumed into the aura of her characters. Interviews asked her not about her inner world, but about her hairstyle, her beauty, her mysterious air. She was spoken of not as a person, but as a symbol, a cipher onto which others projected their fantasies and fears. The war years gave this cipher even greater resonance. To a nation grappling with uncertainty, Veronica Lake represented both allure and ambiguity, the comfort of beauty and the thrill of danger. Her films were more than entertainment. They were rituals of escape, opportunities for audiences to step into a world where passion and betrayal played out in glamorous shadows, where the woman with the hidden eye might hold the key to survival or destruction. In such roles, Veronica was both muse and warning, both dream and nightmare. One might ask, did she understand the archetype she was embodying? Did she realize that she was shaping the language of noir itself, giving it a face that would outlast her? Or was she simply moving through roles, obeying directions, her performances instinctive rather than deliberate? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. Veronica Lake was not an actress of great range, but she was an actress of great presence. Her gift was not in transformation, but in stillness, not in versatility, but in the singular power of her aura. In noir, presence mattered more than range, silence more than dialogue, mystery more than revelation. In this, she was perfectly suited, even if she did not fully choose it. The legacy of these years would outlive her. Long after her star dimmed, critics would point to her performances with Ladd as defining examples of noir's essence. They would note the coolness, the restraint, the way she seemed to float through scenes with a detachment that was at once haunting and intoxicating. They would argue that she embodied the very soul of noir, a world where desire is entwined with danger, where beauty conceals betrayal, where every shadow hides a secret. And yet, in the evenings, when the cameras were packed away and the set stood empty, Veronica returned to herself, or to the fragments of herself that remained. Did she recognize in the mirror the archetype she had become? Did she feel pride in the power she wielded, or weariness at the narrowness of the roles? The answer is lost to us, but the image of her standing before that mirror, hair falling across one eye, remains a haunting one. It is as though she herself was caught between admiration and estrangement, unable to embrace fully the persona she had created, unable to escape it either. The echo of gunfire that lingered in audiences' minds was mirrored by another sound, the sound of a studio door closing behind her, locking her into contracts, binding her to roles, defining her future in terms she had little power to alter. Fame had made her a symbol, but symbols cannot easily live as people. Veronica Lake, femme fatale of the silver screen, was already beginning to feel the cost of becoming an image. The gunfire faded into silence, but the silence itself was heavy, like the weight of a gaze that will not look away. Veronica stood within that silence, luminous and enigmatic, uncertain whether she was shaping her destiny or being shaped by forces beyond her. The femme fatale, the alluring enigma, the woman with the hidden eye, these roles had made her a star. But what would they leave her with when the lights began to dim? The sound of a studio door slamming lingers longer than one expects. It is a sound both sharp and hollow, sharp because it carries finality, hollow because behind it lies a world of silence. For Veronica Lake, that sound was more than the closing of a door at Paramount or on some crowded soundstage. It was the echo of a truth She could not escape. That fame, glittering as it was, came at a cost greater than she had imagined. In those years, when her name still graced the marquees and her image still appeared on glossy magazines, the demands upon her were relentless. Studios owned their stars in ways difficult to fathom now. Contracts dictated not only the films they must make, but the appearances they must attend, the interviews they must give, even the image they must cultivate in public. A studio could design a life as easily as it designed a poster, and for Veronica, the life designed was that of the enigmatic siren, cool and unyielding, a woman who revealed little and promised much. But to live always within a role is to fracture oneself. On the sets of her films, Veronica was expected to deliver that same aura again and again, the veiled glance, the distant tone, the air of mystery. Directors asked for consistency, not exploration, and when she offered variations, when she experimented with her delivery, or when her natural sharpness surfaced, she was often chastised. The whispers began. She was difficult. She was temperamental. She did not cooperate. Yet what is called difficult in women is often nothing more than refusal to surrender entirely. The cost of glamour was more than exhaustion. It was also loneliness. Surrounded by cameras and colleagues, she often found herself isolated, unable to step outside the persona that had made her famous. Journalists sought the icon, not the woman. Fans adored the mystery but cared little for the soul behind it. Even fellow actors sometimes approached her as if she were already her character, aloof and unknowable. In such circumstances, how does one hold onto a sense of self? There are accounts from those years of Veronica's sharp wit, her ability to cut through pretense with a single remark, her unwillingness to flatter those who sought flattery. Some admired her candor, others resented it, but all remembered it. In a world where actresses were expected to smile sweetly, she spoke plainly. In a system where gratitude was demanded, she questioned the demands themselves. And so, the reputation grew. Difficult, uncooperative, hard to work with. Perhaps it was true, perhaps it was exaggerated by those who preferred obedience. Either way, the words clung to her name like shadows. Her rebellion was not always grand. Sometimes it was subtle. A refusal to attend a publicity event, a delayed arrival on set, a disagreement with a director over the reading of a line. Small gestures, yet in the rigid machinery of the studio system, such gestures were magnified. To the men who held power, her resistance was intolerable, her independence unwelcome. They could not see, or perhaps chose not to see, that beneath her refusals was a woman weary of being reduced to a hairstyle, a mystery, a formula. And yet, even in her resistance, she could not entirely escape. The glamour persisted, demanded, insisted. At premieres, she appeared in gowns that shimmered beneath flashbulbs, her hair arranged in the familiar fall that had long since ceased to be accidental. Audiences still adored her, unaware of the battles fought behind closed doors. To them, she was radiant, untouchable, the embodiment of cool allure. To herself, she was growing restless, her spirit chafing against the walls of an image too narrow for the fullness of her being. Alcohol began to accompany her during these years, at first as comfort, later as necessity. A glass before dinner, a drink after a long day on set, a few more during evenings that stretched into the early hours. Hollywood glittered brightly, but in the quiet of night, the brightness gave way to emptiness, and the glass offered a reprieve, a dulling of the ache. It was not yet the destructive force it would later become, but already the pattern was taking shape. Already the shadow of dependence was lengthening across her days. Her marriage to John Detley faltered beneath these pressures. The life of a star, with its constant demands and public scrutiny, left little room for the intimacy of home. Arguments sparked, silences grew heavy, distance widened. The woman celebrated by millions could not find steadiness in her own household. When the marriage ended, it left her both freer and lonelier, the glamour of her public life contrasting sharply with the disarray of her private one. Still, the films continued. Still, audiences filled theaters to watch her glide across the screen, her gaze cool, her beauty untouchable. And still, the studio pushed the same roles, the same image, the same hairstyle. She delivered even when weary, even when restless, even when she longed for something more. But behind the delivery, behind the carefully lit scenes, there was a woman beginning to unravel. The cost of glamour was not only personal, but professional. For the same qualities that made her a star, her mystery, her distance, her refusal to flatter, also made her vulnerable when the tides shifted. In Hollywood, adoration is conditional, and the conditions can change suddenly. A star is celebrated until a new star rises, until a new style is preferred, until the whispers of difficulty outweigh the applause. Veronica, though she did not yet know it, was approaching the edge of that shift. And so, the slam door echoed again and again, not only in studios, but in her spirit. Each time she resisted, each time she spoke sharply, each time she withdrew, the echo grew louder, warning of consequences to come. Yet perhaps she could not have done otherwise. To surrender entirely would have been to lose herself. To resist was to risk losing her career. Between these two losses, she wavered, balancing as best she could upon the fragile edge of fame. Imagine her walking across a studio lot in those years, the California sun casting long shadows, her hair gleaming in the light, assistants hurrying beside her, colleagues glancing with admiration or resentment. Outwardly, she was still the star, the icon, the woman adored across continents. Inwardly, she carried the weight of fatigue, the sting of criticism, the ache of isolation. The sound of the slammed door was never far, reminding her that glamour was both crown and chain. The glamour persisted, but its cost was mounting, unseen by those who adored her, felt only by the woman herself. And in that cost lay the beginnings of decline, the seeds of rebellion, the whispers of ruin. For how long can one play the role demanded when the soul longs for something else entirely? The sound of clinking glasses carries differently depending on the room. In a crowded restaurant, it is festive, a chorus of celebration. In a quiet home, it can be soft, even tender, the prelude to conversation. But in Veronica's life, in those years when the glamour of the screen was beginning to feel like a cage, the clinking of glasses often carried the dull weight of weariness. Each glass filled was a pause, each pause a small retreat, each retreat a surrender to a comfort that asked little and promised only forgetfulness. Her marriage to John Detley had not survived the demands of Hollywood. He was a respected art director, a man of talent and ambition. But the strains of her rising fame, her long hours, her moods sharpened by frustration, proved too heavy. What might have been a shared life became a battlefield of misunderstandings. Even the arrival of a child could not heal the fracture. Love, when pressed between public expectation and private disappointment, often frays. By 1943, they had separated, and Veronica, though adored by millions on screen, found herself once again alone, her life marked by another ending. It was not long before she remarried, this time to director André de Toth, a man as restless and sharp as she was, a Hungarian émigré with a keen eye for stories and an uncompromising nature. To outsiders, their union seemed promising, two strong personalities bound by a shared world of cinema. But strength meeting strength often creates sparks, and theirs were not always sparks of passion but of conflict. Theirs was a marriage of intensity, full of quarrels and reconciliations, of love expressed in sharp tones as often as in tender ones. Alcohol accompanied them both. Hollywood was a place where drinking flowed easily, where studio parties offered endless cocktails, where long evenings were often softened by the clink of ice in glass tumblers. For Veronica, Already carrying the weight of loneliness and restlessness, alcohol became more than habit. It became companion. A glass before dinner, another when conversations grew too sharp, another when silence became unbearable. What began as escape slowly edged toward dependence, a pattern that would tighten its grip as the years wore on. Even as her private life faltered, her career pressed forward. Roles continued, though the freshness of her allure was beginning to wane under the studio's insistence on repetition. Audiences still came, still admired her mystery, but critics began to murmur of sameness, of performances that offered little new. Veronica herself grew frustrated, desiring parts that would challenge her, roles that might allow her to step outside the veil of the femme fatale. Yet the studio, cautious and calculating, preferred the safety of the formula, and so she continued to play the enigmatic woman, even as her real life became more complex, more troubled, more raw than any script allowed. Marriage to de Toth brought children, and with them, moments of genuine tenderness. She could be playful, mischievous, and deeply affectionate with them, qualities the world rarely glimpsed in her films. Yet the tensions between husband and wife often overshadowed the quiet joys of family. De Toth, known for his bluntness, had little patience for Veronica's moods, and she, in turn, bristled at his attempts to control or critique her. Their arguments were legendary, sharp enough to leave scars on both sides. Love was there, certainly, but it was a love that wounded as often as it healed. Hollywood gossip columns fed hungrily on such turbulence. Stories of quarrels, of Veronica's drinking, of her sharp tongue on set began to circulate. The same press that had once elevated her as an icon now began to reshape her image into that of a difficult woman, unpredictable, unstable. Such narratives, once planted, are hard to uproot, and Veronica's reputation suffered. Producers hesitated, directors grew wary, and the opportunities that had once flowed so easily began to thin. Still, she fought. There were films that carried her forward, performances that reminded audiences of her magnetism. But the toll of her private life was visible. Sleepless nights, heated arguments, the dull haze of alcohol. These left their traces, softening the edge of her beauty, dimming the sharpness of her presence. The woman who had once seemed untouchable, the dream pinned on barracks walls, was becoming all too human, her struggles visible in the flicker of her eyes, the tension in her smile. One cannot help but reflect on the cruel symmetry of it. On screen, she was the femme fatale, the woman who lured men into webs of passion and destruction, a figure of danger and allure. Off-screen, she was the one entangled, caught in the snares of expectation, conflict, and self-doubt. The roles mirrored her life in ways perhaps too close for comfort. To audiences, she was mystery. To herself, she was confusion. To the world, she was an icon. To her family, she was a woman wrestling with shadows she could not dispel. There are moments described by those who knew her, moments of disarming warmth, a laugh shared at an unexpected joke, a softness in her voice when speaking to her children, a flash of genuine kindness amid the sharpness of her wit. These glimpses remind us that behind the veil of glamour and scandal was a human soul, longing as we all do for connection, for understanding, for love that heals rather than wounds. Yet these moments, however real, were too often drowned out by the noise of conflict and the dulling of the glass. As the 40s gave way to the early 50s, Veronica's career began to lose its shine. The roles became fewer, the scripts less ambitious, the enthusiasm of audiences tempered by the arrival of new stars, new styles, new obsessions. Hollywood, ever hungry for novelty, began to move on, and Veronica, though still young, found herself slipping into the margins. The woman who had once defined a look, a style, an archetype, was now fighting to hold on to the very stage she had once dominated with ease. And in the silence left by fading applause, the sound of clinking glasses grew louder. It was the sound of retreat, of solace sought in the bottom of a drink, of evenings stretched into hazy nights. The clinking was no longer festive, no longer tender. It was weary, heavy, and unending. The story of Veronica Lake in these years is the story of duality, of a star still luminous on screen even as her private life crumbled, of a woman adored by strangers and yet estranged from those closest to her. It is the story of love pursued and lost, of marriages fractured, of alcohol seeping into the cracks left behind, and it is the story of a spirit growing weary, uncertain how much longer it could endure the cost of being both symbol and self. The glasses clinked again, the sound echoing softly through rooms where arguments faded into silence and silence deepened into loneliness. Outside, the world still remembered her as the woman with the hidden eye, the goddess of mystery. Inside, she was already beginning to unravel. The sound of clinking glasses faded into another rhythm, one harsher and more metallic, the steady hum of wartime factories. In those cavernous spaces where women worked long hours at assembly lines, their hair tied back beneath scarves, their hands guiding metal into forms of war, Veronica Lake's image lingered like a double-edged memory. Her peekaboo hairstyle, once the darling of fashion pages and a comfort to soldiers abroad, now carried with it the whisper of danger. Stray strands of hair caught in machines could mean injury or worse, and what had been glamour became, in the eyes of authorities, a liability. The government, anxious to preserve safety in its industrial army, turned to Veronica herself. Campaigns were organized, photographs arranged, demonstrations staged. There she appeared, her famous locks pinned back, her face as luminous as ever, urging women to abandon the style she had made famous. Newsreels showed her adjusting her hair into practical shapes, smiling as if to say that patriotism required sacrifice, even of beauty. The irony was sharp. An accident had birthed the peekaboo look, and now the same accident was deemed a hazard to the war effort. Did Veronica find humor in this, or bitterness? To be called upon not as a woman or even as an actress, but as a hairstyle that must have carried its own sting. For the world had reduced her once again, defining her not by her craft, not by her voice, not even by her presence, but by the way a strand of hair fell across her face. To be remembered as an image rather than as a soul is a peculiar kind of imprisonment. And yet, even as she posed for those campaigns, even as she urged others to abandon the look, the myth of Veronica Lake deepened. For the forbidden always fascinates, and the hairstyle remained etched in memory, inseparable from her name. Still, the war years brought her acclaim. She was not only a symbol, but an active participant in the machinery of morale. Her image graced posters. Her films played to soldiers in far-off camps. Her name was spoken in letters written across oceans. She was asked to do more than act. She was asked to embody hope, to give shape to longing. In such moments, the boundaries between person and symbol blur entirely. Was she Veronica Lake, the actress, or Veronica Lake, the embodiment of a nation's fragile dream? Behind the gloss, her private life told a different story. The marriage to de Toth was volatile, filled with quarrels as much as with reconciliations. Their home life, often strained, did not resemble the stability her public image suggested. Alcohol, already present in her days, grew more insistent in her nights. What was offered as relaxation became necessity. What was once indulgence became ritual. Friends noticed, colleagues whispered, but Hollywood was a place where excess was often hidden behind velvet curtains. Only later would the full toll become undeniable. On set, Veronica's sharpness of tongue and refusal to flatter authority deepened her reputation for being difficult. Producers sighed, directors rolled their eyes, assistants exchanged knowing looks. Yet it was this very refusal, this unwillingness to bend entirely that kept her alive within the persona constructed around her. The femme fatale she played on screen, distant and untouchable, had roots in the real Veronica, who would not be molded easily. What audiences took as mystery was, in part, her quiet rebellion against being reduced to a puppet. Her films with Alan Ladd continued to resonate. Their chemistry was undeniable, their silences electric. To audiences, they were the perfect noir couple, embodying tension, allure, and the unspoken promise of betrayal. For Veronica, the partnership was a professional salvation, but perhaps also a personal reminder of what connection could feel like, even if only within the confines of a script. Yet even as those films succeeded, the murmurs of decline were beginning. Hollywood is merciless in its appetite, and already younger stars, fresh faces, and new archetypes were crowding the stage. The war ended. The soldiers returned home. The posters were taken down from barracks walls, folded into drawers, or left to yellow in sunlight. The factory floors grew quieter as production shifted back to civilian goods. And with that shift came a change in taste. The femme fatale of the war years, so thrilling amid uncertainty, seemed less essential in the era of post-war optimism. Audiences sought new kinds of stories, new heroines, new ideals. Veronica, still luminous, was in danger of becoming yesterday's dream, yet the memory of those years did not vanish. For many veterans, Veronica Lake remained the face of their youth, the goddess pinned above their bunks, the dream that had accompanied them through fear and longing. They would remember her long after Hollywood had moved on, recalling not the specifics of her performances, but the feeling of her presence. The way her eyes, half hidden, had seemed to promise something more than the world around them could offer. The irony of her wartime fame is sharp. She had been adored as a pin-up, condemned as a safety hazard, exalted as a morale booster, and criticized as a studio headache, all in the span of a few short years. To be so many things to so many people is a burden few can bear. Veronica bore it with her usual mix of detachment and rebellion, but the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. Imagine her, seated in a studio dressing room at the height of her wartime fame. The mirror before her reflects not only her face, but the weight of expectation pressing upon her. On the table lies a comb, a glass half filled with amber liquid, a script awaiting her lines. Outside, soldiers dream of her. Inside, she stares into her own eyes, wondering perhaps who she truly is, the woman, the actress, the symbol, or merely the hairstyle. The hum of the factory floor, though miles away, still echoes in her ears, a reminder that even beauty can be conscripted into service, that even glamour must bow to utility. The hum of those machines would fade, but the unease remained, for if even her hair could be turned against her, what hope did she have of preserving herself? The hum of factory machines, once so constant, slowly faded into silence, leaving only the hollow echo of footsteps. They were her footsteps now, measured and faint, moving across the vast concrete of a studio lot. The sound was not the brisk stride of arrival, but the slower rhythm of departure, each step a reminder that doors once opened easily can close with quiet certainty. For Veronica Lake, the war had given her glory, but peace brought with it something else. The first steep descent from the heights she had scaled too quickly. Hollywood is merciless in its cycles. A star is celebrated until the novelty wears thin, and then the very qualities that once drew admiration are recast as flaws. Veronica, who had captivated audiences with her cool mystery, was now accused of monotony. Critics, once entranced, began to write that she offered little variation, that her aloofness was less allure than limitation. Roles that once seemed written for her grew scarce, and when they came, they carried less promise, smaller budgets, weaker scripts. The studio, once eager to shape her into an icon, now grew restless with its creation. Part of the decline was circumstance. The war had ended, and with it the hunger for femme fatales who embodied both allure and danger. The post-war years sought different archetypes: wholesome heroines, spirited girls next door, women who embodied domestic hope rather than enigmatic threat. Veronica's persona, so perfectly suited to noir shadows, seemed less at home in the bright kitchens and hopeful romances that now filled screens. Her style of beauty, once magnetic, was suddenly deemed too severe, too cold, a remnant of a darker era. But part of the decline was also her own rebellion. Veronica had never been one to flatter authority, and her reputation for being difficult lingered heavily in the corridors of power. Producers remembered her sharpness, directors remembered her refusals, gossip columns magnified every quarrel or misstep. In an industry where stars were expected to be pliant, her independence was read as defiance, her wit as insolence. And so, when casting decisions were made, her name slipped further down the list, overshadowed by younger, more compliant faces. It is not difficult to imagine her in those years, walking from one meeting to another, hearing the polite evasions of executives who no longer saw her as essential. She would have masked her frustration with the same coolness that defined her on screen. But beneath it, the sting must have been sharp. To be adored by millions and yet dismissed by the few who held power. This contradiction marked the beginning of her downfall. The decline of roles also coincided with the escalation of her struggles at home. Her marriage to de Toth, already volatile, grew more strained. Arguments flared, alcohol offered its dull companionship, and the household that might have been a refuge became instead another battlefield. Children heard the raised voices, saw the silences, felt the fractures. Veronica, who could appear so untouchable in films, was deeply vulnerable in her private life, torn between the demands of motherhood, the turbulence of marriage, and the unrelenting pressures of a fading career. There were still films, of course. The Blue Dahlia in 1946 offered one more pairing with Alan Ladd, one more glimpse of the enigmatic power that had defined her. Audiences responded warmly. Critics praised the film, but even in its success, there was a sense of finality. It was less a new beginning than a last great echo. Beyond it, the roles diminished, and with them, the glow of her stardom. Hollywood does not announce its farewells. It simply turns its gaze elsewhere. New actresses arrived, fresh and eager, embodying new styles of beauty and character. The public, ever curious, shifted its devotion with ease, and Veronica, once the face of wartime longing, found herself increasingly absent from the magazines, the posters, the gossip pages. The silence was as sharp as any criticism. What must she have felt in those years? Pride, perhaps, in what she had achieved. Few rise so high. Few are remembered so vividly. But pride mingled with bitterness, for she was still young, still capable, and yet already cast aside. Hollywood had consumed her as it consumes so many, using her image until it no longer suited the times, then discarding it with casual indifference. To be forgotten is hard. To be forgotten while still present is harder still. And so, her footsteps across the studio lot carried a new weight. They were the footsteps of someone leaving not only a set, but an era. The echoes seemed to stretch, long and empty, as though the lot itself knew that the woman walking it had passed her peak. She may have held her head high, her gaze steady, but the silence around her told its truth. The decline did not happen all at once. There were attempts at revival, films that offered glimmers of promise, directors who still believed in her. But the pattern was set, and each disappointment deepened the sense of inevitability. Veronica Lake, the woman with the hidden eye, was becoming hidden herself, fading from the bright lights into the dim corners of memory. The glamour that had once seemed endless now revealed its cost. To rise so quickly, to embody an image so fully, was to leave little room for evolution. Veronica had been fashioned into a symbol, and symbols do not easily change. Yet the world around her demanded change, demanded reinvention, demanded qualities she had never been allowed to cultivate. Her coolness, once her strength, now became her limitation. The same aloofness that had made her unforgettable now made her unwanted. Imagine her at home after a day of rejection, sitting alone with a drink in hand, the glass sweating against her fingers, the script on the table abandoned. Outside, the city pulsed with the energy of new stars, new productions, new dreams. Inside, she listened to the quiet, to the ticking of a clock, to the soft clink of ice melting into amber liquid. The silence of the studio lot had followed her home, and it grew louder with each passing year. The footsteps faded into the night, leaving only the shadow of a woman once adored, now uncertain of her place in the world. Her decline had begun, and though she would fight against it, the tide was already pulling her away from the shore of fame. The lot stood empty, its doors locked, its lights dimmed, and in that emptiness lay the prelude to further unraveling, to deeper struggles, to the long descent that would follow. The silence of the studio lot lingered like a ghost, but it did not remain unbroken. In the quiet of her rooms, another sound replaced it, the sharp crack of ice tumbling into a glass. That small sound, innocent enough in another life, became in hers a prelude to retreat. Where once applause had filled her ears, now it was the clink of cubes against crystal that announced the beginning of her evenings. The drink softened the silence, blurred the edges of disappointment, dulled the memory of footsteps echoing across empty sound stages. Yet what soothed her also bound her, drawing her further into dependency with each pour. Veronica Lake, the star who had once defined mystery itself, was unraveling. Her reputation in Hollywood, already tarnished by whispers of difficulty, grew heavier with each year. Producers remembered the sharp tongue, the lateness, the refusal to play by rules designed for compliance. Directors spoke of her indifference, her seeming lack of interest in her roles. Whether these stories were truth or exaggeration mattered little. Hollywood thrives on narrative, and hers had shifted from adoration to dismissal. The difficult woman, the fading star, the troubled beauty. These labels clung more tightly than any costume. Alcohol deepened the cycle. What began as escape from loneliness became a habit woven into her days. Mornings blurred into afternoons, afternoons into nights, and the glass was always near. Friends noticed the changes. Slurred words, unsteady steps, laughter that carried an edge of despair. Some tried to intervene, others withdrew, unwilling to face the sharpness of her moods when dulled by drink. In an industry already impatient with her, such habits sealed her fate. Offers dwindled further, and those that came were smaller, less dignified, far removed from the glittering premieres of her peak. Her marriage to André de Toth suffered under the weight of these struggles. Their quarrels grew fiercer, fueled by alcohol and pride. Two strong wills, once drawn together by passion, now clashed like storms. Words cut deeply, silence grew heavy, and the children who should have found comfort in their home instead witnessed the disintegration of what had once seemed unshakable. Love was not absent, but it was obscured, drowned beneath conflict and drink. Eventually, as with her first marriage, the union fractured, leaving her once again adrift, carrying not only her own loneliness, but the guilt of lives affected by her unraveling. In public, she still tried to maintain the veneer of the star. Appearances were made, interviews given, photographs posed. But the glow was dimming, the glamour strained. Journalists noted the changes, their tone shifting from admiration to pity, from praise to quiet mockery. The woman who had once enchanted the world with her mystery was now treated as a cautionary tale, her beauty described as fading, her career as stumbling, her life as tragic. The cruelty of Hollywood's gaze is that it seldom looks away. It merely turns colder. It is tempting to imagine her sitting once again before a mirror, though now the reflection staring back was no longer the shimmering vision of youth, but a woman marked by weariness. Did she recognize herself in that reflection? Did she see Constance, the restless girl from Brooklyn, peering through the mask of Veronica? Or did she see only the remnants of an icon, a face that had once defined an era but now carried lines etched by sorrow and excess? Mirrors, once her companions in rehearsal, had become harsher judges than audiences ever were. Her descent was not immediate. There were still roles, still appearances, still traces of the glamour that had once been hers, but each was diminished, each a step further from the heights she had known. The studios no longer called with the urgency of before. Younger actresses filled the screens, embodying the new ideals of post-war America. Veronica, once the symbol of mystery and danger, seemed out of place in these brighter narratives. She belonged to the shadows, and the shadows were receding. The clink of ice in her glass became the rhythm of her life. It marked the passing of hours, the blurring of days, the erosion of ambition. In the haze of alcohol, disappointments were softened, but so too were hopes. The fire that had once driven her to transform herself from Constance to Veronica flickered low, nearly extinguished. Dreams became memories, and memories became burdens. And yet, even in this unraveling, there were glimpses of resilience. Those who knew her spoke of sudden flashes of wit, moments when her old sharpness returned, cutting through the haze with brilliance. There were evenings when she laughed with genuine joy, when her eyes still carried the spark that had once captivated millions. There were days when she dreamed of revival, of a return to the screen, of proving the world wrong. But the drink was always there, ready to pull her back into silence. Public incidents deepened the perception of decline. There were stories of her arriving on set unprepared, of slurred performances, of tempers flaring in rehearsals. Tabloids, always hungry for scandal, magnified each misstep, feeding audiences the narrative of a fallen star. In their pages, Veronica Lake was no longer the goddess of mystery, but the tragic beauty undone by her own flaws. They wrote of her with the cold fascination of spectators at a slow-motion collapse. Her children, caught in the storm, grew up in the shadow of her struggles. To them, she was not merely the star on posters, but a mother whose presence was often fractured, whose moods shifted with the tide of drink and despair. The burden of such memories lingered long after, shaping their own lives in ways difficult to measure. For the unraveling of a star is not confined to the stage. It spills into the lives of all who orbit her. The sound of ice tumbling into a glass grew heavier with each year, no longer a comfort but a chain. Veronica Lake, once luminous, was being consumed not only by the cruelty of Hollywood's indifference, but by her own attempts to soften its silence. What had been glamour became routine. What had been escape became imprisonment. And the world, watching from afar, shifted its gaze to others, leaving her to fade in the background. The silence of the studio lot was replaced by another silence, the silence of a life unraveling quietly, unnoticed by many, remembered by few. Only the clink of glass remained, echoing softly through empty rooms, marking the passage of a woman who had once been a symbol, but was now only herself, fragile, weary, and lost. The glass sat unfinished on the table, its amber contents left to grow flat as the ice melted into water. In the half-light of the room, the drink seemed almost abandoned, as though even that small refuge could no longer be carried to its end. And in that unfinished glass lay a symbol of Veronica's restless years to come, years in which nothing felt fully grasped, in which her life became a series of departures, wanderings, and attempts at reinvention that never quite settled into permanence. Hollywood, once the center of her existence, no longer offered her sanctuary. The decline of her career had closed most of its doors, and the gossip that followed her ensured that even the smallest opportunities were weighed down by doubt. She drifted away from the lots, away from the sound stages that had once celebrated her, into the uncertainty of new pursuits. There were occasional roles, small appearances on television shows or stage productions, but none carried the power of her earlier fame. The bright lights had dimmed, and she moved now in their fading glow, half remembered, half forgotten. New York called to her, as it had once before in her youth. There was something about the city's restless energy, its refusal to settle, that suited her wandering spirit. She lived for a time in hotels, her presence noted only by those who recognized in the quiet figure passing through lobbies the shadow of a former star. On some nights, she dined with friends, her wit still sharp, her laughter still sudden. On others, she withdrew into solitude, her glass once more her closest companion. In New York, she was both visible and invisible, seen by some, ignored by most, lingering like a ghost in a city too busy to pause for memory. Television offered brief glimpses of revival. She appeared on variety shows, small roles that played more on her name than on her talent. The screen, once a canvas for her enigmatic presence, now seemed smaller, less forgiving. Audiences, curious to see the woman they had once adored, tuned in, but their curiosity was fleeting. The glamour that had seemed so effortless on film did not translate well to these appearances, and critics were quick to note the difference. What had once been mystery was now described as detachment. What had once been allure was now called distance. And yet Veronica did not cease to seek renewal. She tried the stage, though the discipline of theater, with its demands of nightly repetition, its lack of cinematic artifice, did not always suit her temperament. Some performances were praised, others dismissed, but none provided the steady ground she sought. She was, in those years, a wanderer, not only of cities, but of forms, searching for a place where she might once again belong. It was during this restless period that she turned to words. If the screen would not hear her, perhaps the page would. In 1969, she published her autobiography, simply titled Veronica. The book, like its author, carried with it both allure and controversy. Within its pages, she recounted her rise, her fame, her conflicts with studios, her marriages, her struggles. There was honesty in her writing, though also bitterness, and many who read it felt they were encountering not the carefully constructed icon, but the wounded woman behind it. The reception was muted. Some praised the candor, others dismissed it as self-indulgent, a grasp for relevance by a woman long past her prime. Sales were modest, and the book quickly slipped from shelves. For Veronica, the disappointment must have been sharp. To pour fragments of herself into words, only to find them ignored, was to feel once more the indifference that had marked her later years in Hollywood. Yet the act of writing, even if dismissed, revealed her desire to assert her own narrative, to reclaim from gossip and rumor some measure of her truth. In the book, she wrote of her frustrations with the industry, her conflicts with those in power, her refusal to conform. She acknowledged her struggles with alcohol, though never with the full weight of confession. She spoke of her marriages, her children, her disillusionments. The tone was not one of triumph, but of reflection, tinged with regret, yet also with defiance. She was not asking for sympathy. She was asserting herself, insisting that her story be told in her own voice, even if the world had ceased to listen. The failure of Veronica as a commercial venture mirrored the failures of her attempts at revival on stage and television. Each effort, though undertaken with sincerity, seemed to falter, leaving her adrift once more. She wandered between cities, between projects, between moments of hope and stretches of despair. She was no longer bound to the studio system that had once confined her, but neither was she anchored by it. Freedom, in her case, felt less like liberation and more like exile. Those who encountered her in these years describe a woman of contradictions. At times, she was charming, warm, witty, capable of captivating a room with her presence. At other times, she was distant, sharp, weary, her beauty shadowed by bitterness. She could be generous, yet she could also wound with a single remark. She carried with her the aura of someone who had seen too much, who had lived too intensely, who bore within her both pride and sorrow. Hotels became her temporary homes, their anonymity both comfort and burden. To live in such transience is to be both everywhere and nowhere, to belong to no one place, to carry one's life in suitcases and glasses. In the stillness of hotel rooms, she must have heard echoes of applause long gone, laughter long silenced, promises never kept. And in those echoes, the sound of ice tumbling into another glass would return, filling the silence that words and applause once held. It is easy to imagine her in such a room. The book she had written resting unopened on a bedside table, the television flickering with the faces of new stars, the city's noise muffled through thick curtains. Outside, life moved on with relentless pace. Inside, Veronica Lake lingered, both participant and spectator in her own decline. She had written her story, but the world had chosen not to read it. She had acted on stage and screen, but the world had chosen not to linger on her performances. She remained, and yet she was already forgotten. The unfinished glass, the unopened book, the hotel key resting on a nightstand, these became the symbols of her wandering years. Each suggested beginnings without endings, attempts without fulfillment, presences without permanence. Veronica Lake was still alive, still moving, still seeking, but her place in the world was no longer secure. She was a wanderer in her own story, drifting through cities and through years, carrying with her the weight of a fame that had once lifted her high and now pressed her low. The glass on the table, left unfinished, waited in silence. The book rested unopened on a dusty shelf, its spine bearing the name that had once drawn millions to theaters, Veronica. It was both testament and plea, a voice pressed into pages that few cared to hear. Dust settled upon it quickly, as if the world itself were eager to forget. And in that dust lay a cruel truth, that when the glamour fades, the world does not pause. It simply turns its gaze elsewhere. For Veronica Lake, the failure of her words to find readers was not only disappointment, but a kind of foreshadowing. The beginning of her transformation into something far harsher, a figure not of fascination, but of ridicule. The tabloids, always eager to feed on decline, sharpened their appetite. Where once they had printed photographs of her in luminous gowns, they now sought her in unguarded moments, catching her in shadows rather than in light. A stumble on a sidewalk, an appearance at a gathering where her sharp tongue cut too deeply, an unflattering glimpse of weariness. These became their currency. Headlines no longer called her a star but hinted at her fall, describing her as troubled, washed up, hard to handle. What had once been mystery became caricature, her cool detachment rebranded as coldness, her independence as arrogance, her weariness as failure. The cruelty of such reimagining lies in its permanence. A rumor once spoken hardens quickly into reputation. Veronica Lake became not the actress of noir shadows, not the wartime icon pinned above soldiers' bunks, but the difficult woman who could not hold her career, the beauty undone by her own vices. The truth of her complexity, her wit, her strength, her flashes of tenderness, was lost in the glare of mockery. She was remembered not for what she had given, but for what she had lost. public appearances grew increasingly painful. Where once audiences had gasped at her presence, now there was often a murmur of recognition tinged with disappointment. "Is that her?" strangers whispered. "She doesn't look the same." Beauty, once her crown, became the measure by which she was judged most harshly. And because beauty fades as it must, she was condemned for failing to preserve what no one can hold. For women in Hollywood, especially in that era, the passage of time was treated not as natural, but as betrayal. Veronica Lake, who had embodied allure itself, now found her aging described not as grace, but as decline. Television appearances only deepened this shift. When she sat for interviews, her sharpness often showed through, her unwillingness to flatter clashing with the polished surfaces demanded by the medium. She did not play the role of the humbled former star. She bristled, defended herself, revealed bitterness. Viewers, conditioned to prefer charm, recoiled. Critics wrote of her as abrasive, ungracious, unwilling to laugh at herself. What they did not see was a woman refusing to be made into a joke, a woman still fighting, however clumsily, to assert her dignity in the face of ridicule. But the fight was uneven. The press had power, and Veronica, stripped of Hollywood's machinery, had little. Each article that mocked her chipped away at what remained of her public image. Each unkind photograph etched itself into memory more deeply than the luminous ones of her prime. The woman who had once represented mystery was now presented as spectacle, her life repackaged as warning. She was no longer the dream, she was the cautionary tale. And yet, behind these stories, Veronica lived on in her own fractured way. Friends spoke of evenings when her wit still flashed like lightning, when her stories of Hollywood days captivated listeners, when her laughter was rich and genuine. She was not without joy, not without resilience, but such moments rarely made the papers. The world preferred the narrative of decline, the easy tale of beauty destroyed by vanity, of talent wasted by arrogance. Such stories comforted readers, assuring them that even stars could fall, that even icons could crumble. There is cruelty in laughter when it is directed at the fallen. The same public that had once adored her now found amusement in her struggles. She was impersonated, caricatured, mocked in gossip. Late-night jokes turned her into shorthand for failure. The woman who had once been mystery incarnate was now reduced to a punchline. And yet, even as ridicule grew, there remained a trace of fascination. For behind every joke lay the memory of the icon she had been, the lingering image of her hair falling across one eye, the shadow of allure that could not be entirely erased. How did she bear it, one wonders, to walk through streets where strangers recognized her with curiosity, edged by pity, to read articles that dismantled her with casual cruelty? Did she grow hardened, indifferent, defiant? Or did each cut wound her still, no matter how many times she told herself it did not matter? Perhaps it was both, alternating like waves, pride and pain washing over her in turns. The unopened book on the shelf, gathering dust, symbolized more than failure. It symbolized silence. She had tried to speak for herself, to tell her own story, to define her own life beyond the gossip and the glamour. But the world had not listened, and the silence that followed was louder than words. In that silence, ridicule found space to grow, filling the void where respect might have remained. The transformation was complete. Veronica Lake, once a star, had become a relic, her name invoked not with awe but with irony. Yet within this transformation lay an unresolved tension. For no matter how the tabloids mocked, no matter how the public shifted its gaze, the films remained. On screens, in reels, in archives, she was still luminous, still mysterious, still powerful. The ridicule of the present could not erase the truth of the past. But for Veronica herself, living day by day, it was the ridicule that pressed most heavily, the ridicule that shaped her final years. The book stayed on the shelf, the dust deepening, the pages unread, and beside it, in the quiet of a forgotten room, the laughter of strangers echoed faintly, not the laughter of joy, but of mockery. Veronica Lake, the woman once dreamed of in barracks and adored in theaters, now lived with that echo, an echo that refused to fade. The faint ringing of a telephone filled the room, a sound once urgent, once connected to the possibility of news, of invitation, of love. But in Veronica's world, the ringing often went unanswered, not because she could not hear it, but because there was no reason to expect that what waited on the other end would bring comfort. The phone, so long a symbol of connection, became instead a reminder of distance. Calls that might have come from children were absent. Calls from friends grew fewer. Calls from lovers arrived only to fade again into silence. Each unanswered ring was another thread cut, another echo of estrangement. Estrangement was not sudden. It rarely is. It grows gradually in small disagreements, in prolonged silences, in unspoken resentments that gather weight over years. Veronica, whose temperament was sharp, whose independence had often made intimacy difficult, found herself slowly separated from those she had once held close. Her children, growing older, carried memories not only of her tenderness, but of her absences, of her struggles with drink, of the turbulence of her marriages. They moved into lives of their own, shaped partly by her and partly against her. The bond between mother and child, though never wholly broken, was stretched thin, almost to transparency. Lovers, too, drifted away. Men drawn to her beauty and wit found themselves entangled in her volatility, her need for independence clashing with their own expectations. She had the capacity to enchant, but also to wound, and relationships that began with promise often ended with bitterness. The marriages had failed, and later partnerships fared no better. Veronica was not an easy woman to love, nor was she willing to feign sweetness for the sake of peace. She demanded honesty, sometimes brutally so, and honesty often proved unbearable. Friends, once plentiful in her Hollywood days, had scattered. Some had been lost to the natural turning of time, others to the simple truth that glamour attracts companions more readily than decline does. A star at her peak is surrounded by admirers, but as the light fades, the crowd disperses, leaving only a handful, and sometimes not even that. For Veronica, whose wit could cut as sharply as her beauty once dazzled, even those handfuls dwindled. She lived more and more in solitude, not entirely by choice, but not entirely against her nature either. Loneliness does not always appear as emptiness. Sometimes it comes as a kind of noise. The noise of thoughts circling endlessly, of regrets replayed, of conversations imagined but never spoken. In her later years, Veronica carried such noise within her. The rooms she inhabited, whether hotels or small apartments, echoed with it. The laughter of her children as they had once been, the applause of audiences long gone, the sharp tones of quarrels, the whispers of gossip, all replayed in memory until memory itself became a prison. And yet, in the midst of estrangement, there were still moments of connection. A letter answered, a visit made, a conversation that broke through the silence. She was not entirely abandoned, though she often felt so. Her children, though distant, carried with them traces of love for the woman who had given them life, however fractured. A few friends, loyal despite the years, still saw in her the wit and charm that once defined her. But these moments were too few to dispel the larger truth, that loneliness had become the defining shape of her days. Veronica herself seemed to invite it at times. She was fiercely protective of her independence, unwilling to submit to expectations of what she should be. If a friend demanded too much, she pulled away. If a lover sought to confine her, she pushed back. Even her children, when they grew critical or distant, found her retreating further rather than pursuing reconciliation. Pride was both her shield and her prison. It kept her from humiliation, but also from healing. The unanswered phone is a cruel image, but it is not the only one. Imagine her sitting in a small room, the curtains drawn against the city outside, a drink on the table, a book unopened beside it. The phone rings once, twice, 3 times, then stops. Silence returns, thicker than before. She does not move toward it. Perhaps she tells herself it is no one important. Perhaps she fears it is no one at all. Perhaps she simply prefers the silence to the disappointment of a voice that brings no comfort. Estrangement is not only from others, but from oneself. Veronica, once so assured in her image, began to lose hold of her sense of identity. Who was she now? Not the star adored by soldiers, not the femme fatale of noir films, not the author whose words were left unread. She was a woman living alone, marked by past triumphs and present losses, defined less by who she was than by who she had been. The dissonance between past and present deepened her isolation, leaving her adrift between memory and reality. And yet, even in this estrangement, she remained unmistakably herself. Her wit, though edged with bitterness, still cut cleanly. Her defiance, though softened by weariness, still resisted submission. She could still laugh suddenly, still charm unexpectedly, still remind those around her of the brilliance she had once embodied. Loneliness had not erased her, it had only shadowed her. Beneath the silence and the distance, the spirit of Veronica Lake flickered, stubborn and enduring, unwilling to be extinguished entirely. The unanswered phone would ring again, and again it would fall silent. Outside, the world continued, indifferent to her solitude. Inside, she sat in rooms filled with echoes, with shadows of connections once cherished, now strained. Estrangement had become her companion, and yet within it she carried a strange resilience. She endured, not happily, not triumphantly, but with the quiet persistence of someone who refused to surrender completely, even when there was little left to hold. The ringing faded, leaving behind the heavy silence of the room. The silence that followed the unanswered phone dissolved into another sound, harsher, smaller, and far more humbling, the rattle of coins on a counter. It was not the sound of wealth counted in studio offices, nor the jingle of jewelry bought with contracts and applause. It was the sound of survival, of a few coins laid down carefully to pay for necessities, of money measured not in stacks, but in handfuls. For Veronica Lake, once a woman whose face had graced posters around the world, poverty was no longer a distant threat. It was her present, the stark reality of her decline. Stories of her working in hotels, tending bars, and taking jobs far from the glamour of Hollywood began to circulate. At first, many doubted them. How could it be possible that Veronica Lake, the goddess of noir shadows, the dream pinned in soldiers' barracks, had come to serve drinks in anonymity? Yet the stories were true. In the late 1960s, she was reported to be working as a cocktail waitress in New York, later as a hotel clerk. Guests, upon recognizing her, sometimes expressed disbelief, others pity, a few even mockery. Some refused to believe their eyes, insisting she was only a resemblance, a woman borrowing the famous name. But she, herself, confirmed it. Veronica Lake, once the icon of mystery, was now working quietly for wages, her past a memory that did not shield her from the present. It is tempting to imagine her behind a counter, her hair no longer arranged in the famous cascade, her face lined with the passage of years, her eyes still cool but edged with weariness. Customers ordered drinks, signed registers, left tips, and went on with their evenings. Perhaps a few lingered, recalling the films, whispering to companions that this woman had once been a star. Perhaps Veronica smiled faintly. Perhaps she bristled. Perhaps she said nothing at all. Pride would not allow her to beg, and so she endured, carrying out her duties with the same sharpness that had defined her in other stages of life. Poverty strips away illusion. The gowns, the cameras, the lights, all were gone. What remained was a woman living by her labor, unshielded by fame, unprotected by fortune. She admitted in interviews that her financial difficulties were real, though she spoke of them with a mixture of candor and defiance. She did not plead for sympathy. She insisted that she was managing, that she was not ashamed of honest work. Yet behind such words lay the unspoken grief of a life that had once promised so much and delivered so cruelly. The rattle of coins is not only the sound of payment, it is the sound of measurement. Each coin weighed against need, against desire, against the memory of a time when such calculations were unnecessary. For Veronica, each coin must have carried with it the echo of her past wealth, the contrast too sharp to ignore. Once she had commanded thousands for a roll, now she measured change for groceries. Once she had been draped in silk on red carpets, now she wore simple clothes behind counters. The transformation was not only external but internal, a stripping away of illusion until only the bare self remained. And yet even in poverty she carried with her a strange dignity. She did not deny her condition, nor did she exaggerate it. She lived as best she could, sometimes with the help of friends, sometimes entirely alone. She was no longer the woman the world adored, but she was still Veronica Lake, still sharp, still unwilling to bow entirely to pity. When asked about her struggles, she replied with wit, sometimes with irritation, always with the edge of someone who refused to be reduced to tragedy alone. The public, when confronted with the reality of her poverty, responded with fascination tinged with cruelty. Newspapers published stories of the fallen star. Magazines photographed her in unglamorous surroundings. Readers shook their heads, some with sympathy, others with smug satisfaction. There is a peculiar comfort people take in seeing those once exalted brought low, as though it reassures them of the fairness of fate. Veronica Lake, once untouchable, now served as such reassurance. Her decline became spectacle, her poverty a story consumed by strangers who would never know the weight of coins in her hand. What did poverty mean to her beyond the daily struggle? Perhaps it offered a kind of clarity. Stripped of illusion, she was free of some burdens, though burdened by others. The studio no longer controlled her image. The public no longer dictated her roles. She was forgotten, yes, but in that forgetting, there was also release. She could walk streets without constant recognition. She could live without the machinery of fame pressing upon her. Freedom and exile are sometimes indistinguishable, and perhaps she felt both. But poverty also meant isolation. Without wealth, friends grow fewer. Without status, invitations cease. Without security, the days stretch long and uncertain. For Veronica, estrangement deepened in these years, not only from family and lovers, but from the life she had once known. Hollywood was a world away, both geographically and spiritually. She lived among strangers now, a woman once luminous, now ordinary, though never entirely ordinary, for the trace of her past could never be erased. The rattle of coins on a counter, repeated daily, became the soundtrack of her survival. It was the sound of endurance, of living one day at a time, of refusing to surrender entirely. In this, there was a kind of resilience, a refusal to vanish completely, even when the world had turned away. Veronica Lake, the woman who had once defined mystery, lived on in the plainest of circumstances, bearing her poverty with the same defiance that had once made her difficult in Hollywood. Yet the tragedy is unmistakable, for no matter how one frames it, the fall from icon to anonymity, from riches to wages, from applause to silence, is a fall steep and cruel. It is a fall that reveals the fragility of fame, the emptiness of glamour, the futility of adoration. Veronica's life in poverty was not only her own, but a mirror held up to Hollywood itself, exposing the way it consumes and discards, the way it forgets even those it once exalted most. The coins rattled once more on the counter, and the sound carried through the room, sharp and undeniable. It was the sound not of mystery, but of reality, not of allure, but of survival. Veronica Lake, who had once lived in the golden glow of Hollywood's dream, now lived in the dim light of ordinary necessity. And in that dimness, she endured, her pride unbroken, her spirit, though weary, still flickering. The rattle of coins upon a counter faded, and in its place came another sound, softer yet equally haunting, the flicker of a projector in an empty theater. The beam of light cut across rows of vacant seats, illuminating dust motes drifting like silent witnesses. On the screen, her face appeared once more, luminous and enigmatic, preserved in shadows of celluloid. But there were no crowds now, no soldiers pressing into chairs for comfort, no couples leaning close in the dark. Only the mechanical hum of the reel, the echo of a world that had moved on. Veronica Lake had returned to the screen, but her return was not triumph. It was a whisper, a curiosity, a relic rather than a revelation. Attempts were made, both by her and by those who remembered her, to spark revival. There were small roles offered, independent projects that sought to harness the nostalgia of her name. Occasionally, she appeared in interviews or on stage, her presence still intriguing enough to warrant attention. Audiences, hearing of her reappearance, were curious, but the curiosity was tinged with something sharper. They wanted not to see Veronica Lake as she was, but as she had been. They wanted the peekaboo goddess, the mystery of the 40s, the dream immortalized in wartime posters. What they found instead was a woman older, marked by years of hardship, her beauty softened by time and shadowed by sorrow. The cruelty of such encounters lay in expectation. No one, no matter how luminous, can remain unchanged by decades. But for Veronica, the comparison was especially harsh. Her fame had been built upon image, upon the perfection of light and hair and gaze. To return to the screen was to place herself once more before the judgment of those who measured her, not against her peers, but against her younger self. She could not win such comparisons. Even her best efforts were dismissed, not because they lacked merit, but because they lacked the illusion of eternal youth. In 1970, she took a role in a low-budget horror film, Flesh Feast, playing a mad scientist feeding maggots to corpses. It was a far cry from the elegance of This Gun for Hire or The Blue Dahlia. Critics were merciless, audiences indifferent. The film did little to restore her reputation. If anything, it confirmed the narrative of decline. To see Veronica Lake, once the queen of noir mystery, in such surroundings was jarring. It was as though the industry had not only forgotten her, but mocked her for daring to return. And yet, even in such roles, there remained flashes of her old presence, a tilt of the head, a glint in the eye, the faintest trace of the allure that had once defined an era. Those who looked closely could still see it, still recognize the essence of what she had been, but few looked closely. Most were content to remark upon the contrast, to note how far she had fallen, to treat her less as an actress and more as a curiosity. She had become a story rather than a star, a symbol of Hollywood's indifference rather than its dream. The projector flickered, casting her younger self on the screen. There she was, frozen in time, her hair falling across one eye, her lips curved in that cool, enigmatic smile. Watching those reels, one could almost believe that nothing had changed, that she remained luminous, untouchable, eternal. But when the reel ended and the lights returned, the reality could not be ignored. Veronica Lake, seated perhaps in the back row of that empty theater, was no longer the woman on the screen. She was older, poorer, marked by loneliness and the dull ache of disappointment. The distance between the woman and her image was almost unbearable. In interviews during these later years, she spoke with candor, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with defiance. She acknowledged her struggles, her reputation, her decline, but she also insisted that she had lived on her own terms, that she had refused to be molded entirely by studios or by public expectation. She admitted to mistakes, to stubbornness, to pride, but she did not beg for sympathy. There was dignity in her honesty, even if it was not the dignity audiences wished to hear. They wanted glamour revived, not truths confessed. Her beauty, once currency, had become a relic. People spoke of it in the past tense as though it were an artifact glimpsed in a museum. She was beautiful, they said. Rarely she is. Veronica herself must have felt the sting of this, though she rarely admitted it. To be remembered for beauty is both gift and curse. It ensures immortality, but it also ensures disappointment in the present. Every glance becomes comparison, every appearance a reminder of what has been lost. For Veronica, whose image had been so central to her fame, the loss was particularly cruel. And yet there were still those who remembered her kindly, who saw in her not only decline but resilience. Veterans who had carried her image during the war still spoke of her with affection, recalling not the faded actress, but the goddess who had been their companion in lonely nights. Film enthusiasts, discovering her performances anew, praised her presence, recognizing in her something timeless that critics of the moment had overlooked. Among such voices, her legacy endured, if quietly. The projector flickered again, perhaps in some small theater, perhaps in the private home of a devoted admirer. On the screen, she remained eternal, her movements precise, her gaze captivating. Off the screen, she endured poverty, ridicule, and the slow unraveling of health. But the two versions of Veronica Lake, the eternal image and the struggling woman, coexisted, bound together, neither fully erasing the other. The flicker of the projector in an empty theater is a lonely sound, yet it is also a sound of persistence. It reminds us that even when audiences have vanished, the image remains. Veronica Lake's later years may have been marked by failure and disappointment, but her younger self still lived in those reels, still shimmered in shadows, still cast her spell on anyone willing to look. That spell could not be undone, even if the woman herself could no longer bear its weight. The projector slowed, the reel ending with a soft, flapping sound as film spun empty against the machine. The lights rose, revealing the emptiness of the room, the silence of seats unfilled. Veronica's resurgence had not come. What remained was memory, flickering faintly in shadows, awaiting the next attempt at revival, the next glimmer of hope. But for now, only dust and silence remained. The flicker of the empty projector, its reel slapping softly at the end of its cycle, gave way to another sound entirely, gentler, older, and more enduring. It was the sound of a slow river moving outside a window in Vermont, its waters carrying fallen leaves and fragments of light toward an unseen distance. That quiet river became the backdrop to Veronica Lake's final years, years of retreat, of illness, of a solitude more profound than any role she had ever played on screen. The woman who had once lived in Hollywood's blaze now lived in the hush of New England, her days measured not by applause but by the rhythm of water passing endlessly by. Her body, marked by years of alcohol, began to fail her. Cirrhosis of the liver was the most relentless of her afflictions, its progress quiet but merciless. The sharpness of her eyes dimmed, her once luminous face thinned, her movements slowed. Pain became a companion, sometimes dulled by medication, sometimes endured in silence. Where once she had filled the world with her presence, she now moved through it quietly, her struggles unseen by all but a few. In the solitude of Vermont, she was not a star, not an icon, not a figure of ridicule or fascination. She was simply a woman confronting the fragility of her body, the inevitability of decline. The loneliness that had marked her earlier years deepened. Estranged from much of her family, distant from her children, separated from lovers and friends, she spent her final years largely alone. A few companions came and went, but there was no permanent circle to surround her, no steady hand to guide her through illness. For someone who had once been adored by millions, such absence was stark. The applause of crowds could not have felt further away than in those rooms by the river, where the only constant sound was the movement of water against stone. And yet, within that solitude, there may have been a strange kind of peace. The machinery of Hollywood no longer reached her. The tabloids, though occasionally printing updates on her decline, did not hound her daily. She was not asked to smile, to pose, to perform. She could sit by a window and watch the river without expectation, without demand. Freedom, though edged with sorrow, was still freedom. She was, at last, beyond the reach of the roles and the ridicule that had defined so much of her earlier life. Her health, however, gave her little reprieve. The cirrhosis worsened, leaving her weakened, her body unable to bear the weight of years of drinking. Other illnesses accompanied it, as though her body, weary of struggle, had decided to yield all at once. Hospital visits became more frequent, the sterile smell of antiseptic replacing the scents of cosmetics and film sets that had once surrounded her. Nurses, many of them too young to have seen her films, cared for her with professional detachment, unaware that the frail woman before them had once been a goddess of the screen. In these final years, Veronica spoke occasionally of her past, sometimes with pride, sometimes with bitterness, often with resignation. She knew she had been a legend. She knew she had been forgotten, and she accepted both as truths. When asked about her career, she responded with candor, refusing to soften her words with nostalgia. She did not pretend her life had been one of unbroken glamour. She admitted its fractures, its missteps, its regrets. But she also refused to apologize for her defiance, for her independence, for her refusal to bend entirely to the will of others. She had lived as herself, even when that self had cost her dearly. The river outside carried on, indifferent to her story, its waters flowing as they had long before she was born, and as they would long after she was gone. Perhaps she took comfort in its constancy, its quiet persistence, its refusal to stop even as seasons changed around it. In the sound of that river, one can imagine her finding a reflection of her own endurance, a life scarred but unbroken, diminished but still moving forward. Neighbors in Vermont sometimes caught glimpses of her, a small, thin woman who carried herself with the trace of dignity that had never quite left her. They may not have recognized her, or if they did, it was as a figure from long ago, a name spoken softly with surprise. Veronica Lake, here among us? The contrast between her past and her present was almost too stark to reconcile. And yet she remained, walking slowly by the river, sitting quietly in her home, living out her days as another soul in a small town. Her final illness brought her to the hospital in Burlington, where the sterile rooms and white sheets replaced the solitude of her Vermont home. There, attended by nurses who knew her as a patient rather than a star, she faced the end with the same detachment that had defined so much of her life. She did not pass surrounded by cameras, nor by the glow of studio lights, nor by adoring fans. She passed quietly, almost anonymously, a woman of 50 years whose fame had burned too quickly, leaving behind only smoke. The river outside her window carried on. It carried with it the last fragments of light, the rustling of leaves, the echo of a life that had flowed from brightness into shadow, from glamour into silence. It did not pause for her passing, just as Hollywood had not paused for her decline. Yet in its endless movement, there was perhaps a reflection of her own story, of a life that moved forward no matter the obstacles, of a current that endured even when diminished. The sound of the river is soft, but it is unyielding. It speaks not of triumph or of failure, but of persistence. And in her final years, Veronica Lake embodied that same persistence. She was no longer a star, no longer an icon, no longer a figure of ridicule or fascination. She was simply herself, enduring until the end, watching the river carry its waters toward a distance she herself would soon travel. The river that moved endlessly outside her window seemed, in those last days, to slow into stillness, as though even nature itself paused in sympathy with her failing body. The waters that had whispered through seasons now carried their voice more faintly, or perhaps it was that her ears no longer heard them as clearly. In the summer of 1973, in Burlington, Vermont, Veronica Lake's journey reached its quiet conclusion. There were no crowds gathered at her bedside, no cameras stationed in sterile halls, no studio executives hovering as they once had in her prime. There was only a small hospital room, the scent of antiseptic, the soft tread of nurses, and the fragile breath of a woman who had once defined allure itself. She was 50 years old, an age that in other lives might still have been considered young, the middle years of a long span. But for her, 50 carried the weight of decades of struggle, of battles fought against studios, against gossip, against herself. Her liver, destroyed by cirrhosis, could no longer bear the toll of years of drinking. Her body, thin and weakened, bore the marks of illness and hardship. Once luminous, she now lay in shadow, her presence unnoticed by a world that had long since turned its gaze elsewhere. The nurses who tended her knew her only as a patient, a woman slipping quietly toward the end. Some may have recognized her name, others not. For them, she was not the femme fatale of this gun for hire, not the mystery of the peekaboo hair, not the icon pinned to soldiers' walls. She was simply Veronica Lake, a woman in pain, fragile, fading. In their hands, she received the care of strangers rather than the devotion of admirers. It is a peculiar truth of fame that those who are adored most intensely are often left most alone at the end. The applause that had once thundered in theaters, the letters that had once filled studio mailrooms, the dreams that had once carried her image into the hearts of millions, none of these remained now. There was only silence, broken by the beeping of machines, the shuffle of shoes along linoleum, the slow rhythm of her breath. On July 7, 1973, that breath ceased. Veronica Lake, born Constance Frances Marie Ockelman, was gone. She had lived 50 years, of which only a handful had been filled with the brilliance of true stardom. Yet those years had been enough to etch her name forever into the history of cinema, enough to create an image that even her decline could not erase. Still, at the moment of her death, there was no grand acknowledgement. Hollywood did not stop. Newspapers did not rush to print headlines. The world largely did not notice. Her ashes were scattered in Florida, though even this act carried the quietness of neglect. There were no great ceremonies, no tributes attended by crowds, no colleagues gathered in reverence. The scattering was simple, nearly anonymous, her remains carried into the air and then into the earth, much as her life had been carried into memory and then into silence. Later, a portion of her ashes would be taken by a friend to Vermont, returned to the state where she had spent her last days. It was a small gesture of remembrance, a final attempt to give her rest in the place where her river had flowed. The stillness that followed her death was as stark as the silence that had preceded it. For a time, there were a few obituaries, a few columns that noted the passing of a once famous actress. Some critics recalled her beauty, her films with Alan Ladd, her iconic hairstyle. Others focused on her decline, her poverty, her troubles. Even in death, the narrative of her life remained fractured, half allure, half ruin. Yet what was most striking was how quickly the world moved on. Unlike other stars whose deaths inspired mourning across continents, Veronica Lake's passing was absorbed quietly into the flow of time. And yet death has a way of softening memory. Over time, the ridicule faded, the gossip grew faint, and what remained were the films themselves, the images that could not die. On screen, she was still luminous, still mysterious, still unforgettable. The celluloid preserved her not in decline, but in radiance, her hair falling across her eye, her gaze cool and enigmatic. Those who returned to her films after her death found her again as she had been, untouched by time, frozen in the shadows of Noir. It is difficult not to wonder what thoughts passed through her mind in those final days. Did she recall the laughter of her children when they were small? Did she remember the long hours of filming, the bright lights of premieres, the sound of soldiers cheering as her face appeared on screens far from home? Did she regret, or did she resign herself? Or did she simply grow too weary to dwell on memory at all? Perhaps, as the river flowed outside, she thought only of its persistence, of the way life continues regardless of triumph or failure. Her death at 50 was both too soon and strangely fitting, for Veronica Lake had always carried within her the tension of brevity, her rise sudden, her fame meteoric, her decline swift. She was not a figure of long endurance, but of fleeting brilliance, a star who burned brightly and then was gone. To live longer, perhaps, would have been to prolong her suffering, to deepen her solitude. To leave when she did was to allow her legend to settle, to remain unfinished in a way that makes her memory all the more haunting. The river outside her window flowed on, its waters indifferent to her passing, and yet, in its endlessness, it carried something of her story. For though Veronica Lake was gone, though her ashes scattered quietly, her image remained. In films, in memories, in the echoes of those who once adored her, she flowed still, luminous in shadow, eternal in her impermanence. The stillness of that hospital room, the scattering of ashes, the fading of her name from daily speech, all these marked the end of a life. But the films flickered on, the projector still hummed, the river still moved, and in these she was not entirely lost. Her name faded softly into silence, spoken only in passing, sometimes misremembered, sometimes recalled with a half-smile by those old enough to have known her films. For most, she was no longer a presence in life, but a whisper in memory, a face glimpsed in old magazines left in attics, or a name in columns yellowed by time. Yet memory has its own persistence, and in darkened rooms where reels still turned, she was not silent. The hum of a projector running endlessly, its beam cutting through shadows, restored her to life. On the screen, Veronica Lake remained luminous, untouched by decline, preserved forever in the flicker of film. There she was again, stepping into the frame, her hair cascading across one eye, her voice carrying its cool, level tone, her movements sharp yet fluid. Audiences, decades removed, could still feel the allure, could still understand why soldiers had pinned her face above their bunks, why directors had lingered on her gaze, why her image had become an icon. Time had erased her body, her struggles, her loneliness, but it could not erase the presence captured on celluloid. In that flicker, she endured. Film scholars rediscovered her in later years, writing of her contributions to Noir, her embodiment of the femme fatale archetype. They spoke of her subtlety, her restraint, her ability to hold the screen with stillness rather than excess. They compared her to others who had played similar roles, noting how her cool detachment distinguished her, how her mystery seemed less performed than innate. She was not merely an actress, she was a presence, a force that drew attention without asking for it, that compelled without effort. In their essays and retrospectives, they restored a measure of dignity to a woman who had been mocked in life's later chapters. Fans, too, returned to her films. Young viewers, Encountering her for the first time, we're struck by the freshness of her presence, by how modern she seemed, despite the distance of decades. The peekaboo hair, once dismissed as a fad, now appeared timeless, a symbol of individuality rather than conformity. Her silences, once criticized as flatness, were recognized as subtle power. Her distance, once mocked as coldness, was seen as strength. In memory, she was transformed, her flaws softened, her brilliance sharpened. The films allowed her to live again, not as she had been in poverty or ridicule, but as she had been in light. For veterans, her memory lingered differently. They recalled not the critic's words or the scholar's analysis, but the simple truth of her presence in a time of fear. To them, she was not only an actress, but a companion, a dream that had carried them through sleepless nights, a reminder of home and beauty amid destruction. Letters written in barracks spoke her name with devotion. Photographs folded into pockets carried her image across oceans. Decades later, those memories had not faded. For those men, Veronica Lake remained the embodiment of longing, preserved not only in film, but in the deepest corners of their hearts. The hum of the projector became her afterlife. Each time the reel turned, she was reborn, stepping once more into shadows, gazing once more with that enigmatic glance, speaking once more in that cool tone. Death could not touch her there. Poverty, ridicule, estrangement, all were erased by the screen. The woman who had died in silence lived in light, eternal in the flicker, permanent in impermanence. And yet, even in this endurance, there was ambiguity. For the woman in the film was not the woman who had lived. The films preserved Veronica Lake, the icon, but they did not preserve Constance Ockelman, the girl who had lost a father, the woman who had quarreled with husbands, the mother estranged from her children, the wanderer of hotels. They did not preserve the sound of ice in a glass, the rattle of coins on a counter, the stillness of a Vermont river. They preserved only the illusion, the mask, the mystery. And so her afterlife, while luminous, was incomplete. It was a half-truth, beautiful, but insufficient. Perhaps this is what makes her memory so haunting. We watch her films and are captivated, but we know there was more. Something hidden behind the veil of glamour, something we will never fully know. The mystery remains, not only in her characters, but in her life itself. Was she victim or rebel? Was she destroyed by Hollywood, or did she destroy herself? Was she the icon she appeared to be, or was she always something other, something ungraspable? These questions echo like the hum of the projector, never answered, never silenced. In this way, Veronica Lake became more than a person. She became an enigma that lingers. We remember her not with certainty but with doubt, not with closure but with questions. And perhaps that is fitting, for mystery was always her greatest gift. To reveal everything would have been to end her power. To conceal is to endure. And so she endures, concealed even now, her true self lost in shadows, her image immortal. The projector runs endlessly, its beam unwavering. On the screen, she is forever young, forever luminous, forever untouchable. In life, she was fragile, wounded, undone. In memory, she is eternal, preserved in the cool shadows of Noir. Between these two truths lies her legacy, a legacy not of perfection but of haunting, not of certainty but of allure. The hum grows steady, filling the silence like a heartbeat. Veronica Lake, once forgotten, is remembered again, not in the way she might have wished, perhaps, but remembered nonetheless. In the dark, her face appears once more, and for a moment, she is alive again. The endless hum of the projector softened at last into silence, the reel running empty, the light dimming until the screen was bare. In that silence, Veronica Lake remained, not as a woman walking across a studio lot, nor as a mother sitting by a window in Vermont, but as a shadow upon memory. It is there, in the space between light and dark, between truth and illusion, that she lingers still. Her life was never a single story, but a tapestry woven from contradictions, allure and ruin, fame and obscurity, strength and fragility. To speak of her is to speak not of certainty, but of questions that remain unresolved, questions that drift like leaves upon the current of time. She was, in one sense, a creation of accident. Her hairstyle, born not from design but from chance, catapulted her into immortality. Yet she was also a woman of will, sharp-tongued, unwilling to bend entirely to others, insistent upon her independence even when it cost her dearly. Was she victim of Hollywood's cruelty or architect of her own undoing? The truth lies somewhere in the shadows, impossible to separate, inseparable from the image she herself came to embody. Her allure was undeniable. On screen, she was not simply beautiful but compelling in her stillness. She did not beg for attention. She demanded it by withholding. She became the essence of the femme fatale, not by overt seduction but by quiet distance, by the suggestion of secrets untold. That distance was both her gift and her curse. It drew the world to her, but it also estranged her from it. For those who adored her on screen rarely cared to know the woman off it. They adored the mystery, not the person. And the mystery, once fixed, allowed no room for change. Her ruin was equally undeniable. Alcohol dulled her days, conflict marked her marriages, poverty shadowed her later years. She endured estrangement from children, ridicule from tabloids, loneliness in places far removed from the sound of applause. Her end was quiet, her ashes scattered without ceremony, her name spoken more as curiosity than reverence. To see such ruin in one who had once been exalted is to confront the fragility of fame itself. For what is adoration if it can vanish so quickly? What is beauty if it can turn so swiftly to mockery? And yet neither allure nor ruin tells the whole of her story. Between them lies the humanity often forgotten, the moments of laughter, of tenderness with her children, of wit shared among friends, of resilience even in poverty. She was not only icon or tragedy, she was a woman who lived fully, if chaotically, who carried both brilliance and flaw within her. To remember only the glamour or only the decline is to miss the truth. The truth is in the tension between them, in the ambiguity that remains. Her legacy endures in the flicker of her films, in the essays of scholars, in the memories of those who once adored her. But it endures also in the questions she leaves behind. What did she feel, sitting alone in a hotel room with an unfinished glass by her side? What did she think walking across an empty studio lot, hearing the silence where once there had been applause? Did she regret her defiance, or did she hold it as her truest strength? Did she long for forgiveness, or did she prefer the solitude she often seemed to choose? These questions cannot be answered. They linger as unresolved as her gaze upon the screen, as enigmatic as the fall of hair across her eye. Perhaps this is why she continues to haunt us. For in Veronica Lake, we see not only the glamour of an age, but the cost of it. Not only the dream of Hollywood, but its shadows. She was both muse and warning, both star and exile. Her story reminds us that beauty is fragile, that fame is fleeting, that the human soul cannot be contained by image alone. And yet, her story also reminds us that presence endures, that a glance, a voice, a silhouette can outlast the ruins of a life, can live on in the memory of those who were touched by it. The silence after the projector's hum is not empty. It is filled with echoes, the laughter of soldiers who once carried her photograph, the murmur of audiences in theaters gone dark, the soft clink of ice in a glass, the sound of a river moving endlessly by. These echoes are her afterlife, fragments of a life both luminous and broken. We cannot gather them into a single coherent story. We can only listen, and in listening, remember. So let us remember her not only as the goddess of shadows, nor only as the woman who died in solitude, but as both. Let us remember her as a figure of contradiction, of allure entwined with ruin, of mystery that remains unresolved. Let us allow her to linger in ambiguity, as she always did, neither fully revealed nor fully concealed, for perhaps that is the truest tribute to Veronica Lake, to let her remain a mystery, forever half hidden, forever half seen, forever flickering between light and shadow. And as the silence deepens, as the reel runs empty and the screen fades to blankness, we are left with a final image. Her gaze, cool and enigmatic, her hair falling like a veil across one eye. It is an image that does not end, an image that drifts with us into memory, an image that reminds us of beauty and fragility, of allure and ruin, of the strange persistence of mystery. The silence is unresolved, and so too is her story. But perhaps it is better that way. For some lives are not meant to be concluded neatly. Some lives are meant to echo, to haunt, to linger like the faint sound of a projector in the distance, running without end.